Beneath the surface of the Pacific, where sunlight fades into absolute darkness and pressure crushes steel like paper, lie secrets that navies would prefer remained buried. During the chaos of World War II, submarines vanished with such frequency that many disappearances were simply recorded as lost on patrol and filed away. But among the hundreds of vessels that never returned, a handful of Japanese submarines disappeared under circumstances so strange that even decades later, naval historians speak of them in hushed tones. These weren't ships destroyed in known engagements or found rusting on the seabed. These were submarines that radioed their positions, reported no problems, and then ceased to exist as though they had slipped through a crack in the ocean itself. Tonight, we descend into the cold depths where these vessels made their final transmissions and explore the mysteries that still echo through the silent water. The morning of October 16th, 1944, began like any other patrol day for the crew of I-26, a Type B-1 submarine that had become one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most successful hunters. With 14 confirmed kills to her name, including the light cruiser USS Juneau that took the 5 Sullivan brothers to their deaths, I-26 had earned a reputation that made Allied sailors nervous whenever she was reported in their waters. Her commander, Captain Minoru Kusaka, had earned the respect of his crew through 2 years of combat operations that took them from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Sea. He was known for his caution, never taking unnecessary risks, always ensuring his boat and crew survived to fight another day. That morning, as I-26 slipped beneath the surface near the Admiralty Islands, everything appeared routine. The diesel engines had run smoothly during the night surface transit, the batteries were fully charged, and the torpedo room reported all 20 Type 95 torpedoes secured and ready. The sea conditions were ideal for submarine operations. A light chop on the surface provided cover from aerial observation, while the water temperature created a thermal layer at 180 feet that would help mask their presence from enemy sonar. The crew moved through their stations with the efficiency of men who had performed these same tasks hundreds of times before. In the control room, the diving officer called out depth readings as they leveled off at periscope depth. The boat trimmed perfectly, hanging motionless in the current. According to the patrol orders recovered after the war, I-26's mission was straightforward. Proceed to the shipping lanes between Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo, remain on station for 14 days, and attack any enemy vessels that presented favourable opportunities. Intelligence reports suggested that American supply convoys were moving through the area with minimal escort, making them vulnerable to a skilled submarine commander. Captain Kusaka had executed similar patrols dozens of times. There was no reason to expect this one would be any different. The submarine's design incorporated lessons learned from earlier boats. At 356 feet in length and displacing 2,184 tons surfaced, I-26 represented the peak of Japanese submarine engineering in the early war years. Her Type B-1 classification meant she carried a reconnaissance seaplane in a hangar aft of the conning tower. Though by 1944, these aircraft were rarely deployed due to the time required to assemble them and the vulnerability of a surface submarine. The hangar space was more often used for additional supply storage on extended patrols. Her crew of 94 men lived in conditions that would be considered unbearable by modern standards. The interior temperature regularly exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity made every surface slick with condensation, and the air grew increasingly stale as the carbon dioxide scrubbers struggled to keep pace with the breathing of so many men in such a confined space. Yet these sailors had adapted, learning to sleep in shifts on bunks stacked 3 high, eating meals of rice and canned fish while the boat rolled in the swells, maintaining their equipment even as rust crept across every metal surface. As I-26 set course for her patrol area that morning, passing through water that changed from the pale blue of shallow reefs to the deep indigo of the open ocean, none of the crew could have known they were steaming toward a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. The boat's log, maintained with meticulous precision up to that point, would soon contain its final entries. But before the silence came, there would be one last transmission. At 0847 hours, the communications officer aboard I-26 transmitted a routine position update to Naval headquarters in Truk. The signal was clear, the coordinates precise. Approximately 240 nautical miles northeast of the Admiralty Islands, steaming on a heading that would take them toward the shipping lanes near Guadalcanal. The transmission lasted approximately 45 seconds, encoded using the standard naval cipher that changed daily according to codebooks secured in the captain's safe. The radio operator, a young petty officer named Hiroshi Tanaka, had sent hundreds of similar messages during his 2 years aboard I-26. He logged the transmission in his communications record, noting the signal strength as good and the atmospheric conditions as clear. There was nothing in his notations to suggest any concern, no mention of equipment malfunction or unusual interference. At the receiving station in Truk, the signal was intercepted and decoded by the communications watch, who plotted I-26's position on the large tactical map that covered one wall of the operations center. The submarine appeared exactly where she should be according to her patrol orders, making good time toward her assigned station. The watch officer initialed the log entry and filed the message with dozens of others received that morning from submarines scattered across the Pacific. It was routine, unremarkable, the kind of administrative detail that kept the submarine fleet coordinated but rarely warranted a second thought. What made this particular transmission significant was the additional information included beyond the basic position data. Standard procedure required submarines to report their fuel state, any mechanical issues, and an assessment of enemy activity in their area. I-26's message indicated fuel consumption within normal parameters, all systems functioning properly, and no enemy contact since departing their last position. The message concluded with a confirmation of their next scheduled transmission time. 2,100 hours that same evening. Approximately 12 hours later, the radio conditions that morning were particularly favorable for long-distance communication. Solar activity was low, reducing the atmospheric interference that often plagued high-frequency transmissions in the Pacific. The ionosphere provided excellent signal bounce, allowing I-26's relatively low-powered transmitter to reach Truk clearly despite the distance. These same conditions would have made the evening transmission equally reliable, assuming the submarine surfaced at the scheduled time and her radio equipment continued functioning normally. In the operations center at Truk, staff officers monitoring the submarine fleet's movements had no reason for concern. I-26 was one of their most reliable boats, commanded by one of their most experienced captains. Her track record spoke for itself: numerous successful patrols, significant enemy tonnage sunk, and a crew that functioned with the precision of a well-oiled machine. If any submarine could be counted on to complete her patrol and return safely, it was I-26. The weather forecast for I-26's patrol area predicted typical conditions for mid-October in that part of the Pacific. Visibility generally good except when reduced by rain. Nothing that would pose a threat to a submarine or interfere with normal operations. Surface water temperature was recorded at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, with a thermocline layer at approximately 200 feet that would provide excellent cover from enemy sonar. Every factor pointed toward a routine patrol. As the morning progressed in the operations center, I-26's position marker remained fixed on the map, a small magnetic counter representing 94 men and 2,184 tons of steel moving through water that reached depths exceeding 15,000 feet. The next scheduled update would move that marker closer to the patrol area, just another incremental step in what was expected to be a 14-day mission. But that update would never come. When I-26 failed to report at her scheduled check-in 12 hours later, the duty officer in Truk noted the absence but wasn't immediately concerned. Radio silence was often maintained to avoid detection, and experienced commanders like Captain Kusaka knew when to stay quiet. The standing orders for submarine operations allowed considerable discretion to commanding officers regarding radio transmissions. If a submarine detected enemy forces in the area, standard procedure was to maintain complete radio silence to avoid giving away their position. Allied direction-finding stations had become increasingly sophisticated at triangulating the source of radio transmissions, and more than one Japanese submarine had been lost after being located through their routine position reports. The balance between maintaining communication with headquarters and preserving operational security was something every submarine commander wrestled with on every patrol. The duty officer that evening, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, had spent 3 years in the submarine service before being assigned to headquarters staff. He understood the realities of submarine operations, the equipment failures that could knock out a transmitter, the atmospheric conditions that could make communication impossible, the tactical situations that required absolute silence. When he noted I-26's missed check-in, he marked it in the log with a notation that the submarine was maintaining radio silence, probable enemy contact. It was the most likely explanation, and certainly not cause for immediate alarm. As the night progressed and the operations center cycled through its watch changes, I-26's silence continued. The 0300 hours watch noted that she had now missed 2 scheduled transmissions. Again, this wasn't unprecedented. Submarines sometimes went days without communication when operating in waters where enemy patrol aircraft were active. The longer the silence, however, the more questions began to form. By dawn on October 17th, I-26 had been out of contact for nearly 24 hours. The communications staff made several attempts to raise the submarine using the standard call and response protocols. Every 4 hours, they would broadcast a coded message on I-26's assigned frequency, requesting a position report or at minimum an acknowledgement that the transmission had been received. These messages went unanswered, disappearing into the static and atmospheric noise that constantly filled the radio spectrum. It was like calling into a void and hearing nothing but silence in return. By the evening of October 17th, staff officers were conferring in hushed conversations, consulting patrol maps, and trying to calculate whether I-26 might have diverted from her assigned route. Perhaps Captain Kusaka had detected a significant target and was pursuing it outside his designated area. Perhaps he had encountered enemy forces and was evading them. Perhaps his radio equipment had failed completely, leaving him unable to communicate despite repeated attempts. Each scenario was plausible, yet each still left the troubling question. Why no emergency procedures? Why no attempt to reach an alternative communication station? Why absolute silence? The submarine service maintained a network of backup communication protocols for exactly these situations. If a primary radio failed, submarines carried portable emergency transmitters that could be deployed from the surface. If atmospheric conditions prevented communication with Truk, submarines could attempt to reach other stations in the Marshall Islands, or even neutral vessels that might relay messages. The complete absence of any communication from I-26 through any channel, by any means, suggested something more serious than simple equipment failure. 3 days after her last transmission, the silence had taken on a weight that could no longer be explained away by standard operational procedures. I-26 wasn't just maintaining radio silence, she had ceased to exist as far as the naval command structure was concerned. And that was when the real questions began. 3 days passed before Naval Command acknowledged that I-26 was officially overdue. A search pattern was organised, with 4 submarines dispatched to comb the area around her last known coordinates, their sonar pinging through the dark water, listening for the telltale sounds of a vessel in distress. The search orders went out on October 19th, transmitted to 4 submarines operating in adjacent patrol areas. I-36, I-38, I-47, and I-53 were redirected from their assigned missions and ordered to converge on the coordinates where I-26 had sent her final transmission. Each submarine was assigned a sector to search, creating a grid pattern that would cover approximately 10,000 square nautical miles of ocean. It was a massive search area, but given the uncertainty about I-26's movements after her last report, the search planners couldn't afford to be more specific. The submarines began arriving in the search area on October 20th, each surfacing periodically to scan the horizon for any sign of debris, oil slicks, or survivors. They dove and ran patterns with their sonar active, listening for the distinctive acoustic signature of a submarine hull settling on the ocean floor or the sound of air escaping from a damaged pressure vessel. The water in that region averaged 8,000 feet deep, with some areas plunging to over 15,000 feet depths that would crush a damaged submarine into unrecognizable wreckage within seconds. I-36's commander reported detecting an oil slick on October 21st, approximately 60 miles from I-26's last known position. Surface vessels were requested to investigate, and a patrol boat was dispatched from Naval to collect samples. The analysis would later show the oil to be consistent with diesel fuel used by Japanese submarines, but the quantity was small, perhaps 50 gallons, spread across several square miles of ocean. It could have come from I-26, or it could have been discharged by any of dozens of other submarines operating in the area. The search continued for 8 days, each submarine running systematic patterns through their assigned sectors. they found nothing more. No debris field indicating a catastrophic explosion, no scattered life rafts or emergency equipment, no bodies floating in life vests, no distress buoys that submarines could release if they were sinking but still had time to signal their position. The ocean had swallowed I-26 completely, leaving behind only that small oil slick and questions that multiplied with each passing day. Allied records examined after the war showed no anti-submarine actions in the area during the relevant time period. No depth charges were dropped. No torpedoes were fired at submarine contacts. No aircraft reported attacking a surface submarine. The nearest Allied naval forces were over 300 miles away, well beyond the range where they could have detected or engaged I-26. If the submarine had been sunk by enemy action, there was no evidence of it in the meticulously maintained American and Australian combat logs. The possibility of mechanical failure was considered. Type B-1 submarines, while generally reliable, were not immune to catastrophic equipment malfunctions. A battery explosion could fill the submarine with chlorine gas and force an emergency surface, where she might be vulnerable to air attack. A hydraulic failure could jam the diving planes and send the boat plunging beyond her crush depth. A breach in the pressure hull from metal fatigue or undetected damage could cause instant implosion. Any of these scenarios could explain a sudden sinking without warning or transmission. Yet even mechanical failure should leave some trace. When submarines sank, they typically released air from ruptured tanks, creating bubbles that rose to the surface and sometimes carried debris with them. The pressure wave from an implosion at depth could be detected by hydrophones hundreds of miles away. The complete absence of any such indicators suggested that whatever happened to I-26 occurred in a way that left no evidence behind, as if she had simply dematerialized rather than sunk. By October 28th, the search was called off. The 4 submarines were returned to their normal patrol duties, and I-26 was officially listed as lost with all hands, cause unknown. Her name was added to the growing list of submarines that had vanished during the war, a list that would eventually include over 50 vessels from the Imperial Japanese Navy alone. It wasn't until 1992, nearly 50 years after her disappearance, that a deep-sea survey expedition stumbled upon wreckage matching I-26's specifications. The submarine lay at a depth of 4,200 feet, her hull remarkably intact for a vessel that should have been torn apart by depth charges or torpedo impact. The discovery was made by the research vessel Laney West, conducting a deep-sea mapping survey for underwater telecommunications cable routes. The ship's side-scan sonar had been methodically sweeping the ocean floor, creating detailed images of the underwater topography, when the distinctive shape of a submarine appeared on the monitors. The survey team immediately recognized they had found something significant, though they had no way of knowing initially whether it was a Japanese, American, or possibly even a German U-boat. A remotely operated vehicle was deployed to investigate, descending through the water column for nearly 40 minutes before reaching the wreck site. The ROV's cameras transmitted images back to the surface that showed a submarine resting upright on a relatively flat section of the seabed. Her bow pointed northeast, her conning tower still intact. There was none of the catastrophic damage that would be expected from a depth charge attack or torpedo hit. No massive holes in the hull, no severed sections, no debris fields spreading across the ocean floor. The ROV made several passes along the submarine's length, documenting every detail. The hull number had been worn away by decades of current and the slow accumulation of sediment, but the overall dimensions and design features matched those of a Type B-1 submarine. The distinctive aircraft hangar aft of the conning tower was clearly visible, its door closed and intact. The deck gun had broken away from its mount and lay on the seabed nearby. But otherwise, the external structure showed remarkable preservation. What puzzled the researchers most was the depth. At 4,200 feet, I-26 rested well beyond her rated crush depth of approximately 1,000 feet. The submarine should have imploded catastrophically once she passed that threshold, her hull crumpling like a tin can under the immense pressure of 1,800 pounds per square inch. Yet here she lay, her pressure hull apparently intact, suggesting she had somehow descended to this depth without suffering the structural failure that should have been inevitable. The ROV positioned itself near one of the submarine's viewing ports, illuminating the thick glass with its powerful lights. The port was intact, unbroken, which seemed physically impossible given the pressure at this depth. The researchers noted this in their report, flagging it as an anomaly that would require further investigation and analysis by naval architects familiar with submarine design parameters. Several attempts were made to peer inside the hull through the viewing ports, but sediment and biological growth obscured the glass, making it impossible to see into the interior. The ROV's manipulator arm gently brushed away some of the accumulation, but decades of marine growth had effectively sealed the port. Whatever secrets lay inside, I-26 would remain hidden, unless a more invasive investigation was authorized. The mystery deepened when the research team examined the submarine's external fittings and hatches. All were closed and appeared to be properly secured, suggesting the submarine had been operating normally when she went down. There were no signs of emergency measures, no blown ballast tank vents, no jettisoned equipment, no indication that the crew had attempted to abandon ship. It was as if I-26 had simply descended deeper and deeper until she came to rest on the bottom, her crew still inside, unaware or unable to prevent their descent into the abyss. Subsequent analysis of the sonar data revealed something even more unusual. The seabed around I-26 showed no impact crater or disturbance pattern that would indicate the submarine had plummeted to the bottom at high speed. Instead, the sediment pattern suggested she had settled gently onto the ocean floor, almost as if she had been placed there deliberately. This finding contradicted every known scenario for submarine loss. Whether from combat damage, mechanical failure, or crew error, submarines sink quickly once they lose buoyancy control, hitting the bottom with considerable force. The Japanese government was notified of the discovery, and naval historians confirmed that the wreck's location corresponded to I-26's last known patrol area. However, no recovery operation was ever mounted. The depth made it prohibitively expensive, and the wreck was designated as a war grave, leaving I-26 and her crew to their silent rest in the darkness. But the questions raised by her condition would continue to haunt researchers for years to come. Gold bars stacked in waterproof containers, technical blueprints for jet engine designs, 2 German scientists with knowledge that could change the course of the war. I-52 wasn't just another submarine when she departed Kure on March 10th. 1944, she was a floating vault carrying Japan's most valuable cargo toward occupied France. The mission had been planned for months, at the highest levels of both the Japanese and German governments. As the war turned increasingly against the Axis powers, the need to share technology and resources became desperate. Japan possessed raw materials that Germany needed: rubber, tungsten, molybdenum, and tin. Germany possessed advanced technology that Japan desperately wanted: radar systems, acoustic torpedoes, and jet engine designs that promised to revolutionize aerial warfare. I-52 would be the vessel to bridge that gap. Her cargo manifest, recovered from Japanese naval archives after the war, read like a wish list of strategic materials. 2 tons of gold, divided into 146 bars and packed in 49 metal boxes, served as payment for German technology. The gold alone was worth approximately $3 million. In 1944 currency, roughly $50 million in today's values. But the mineral cargo was equally valuable. 228 tons of raw materials, including 54 tons of tungsten, 3 tons of opium for pharmaceutical use, 3 tons of quinine for treating malaria, and smaller quantities of molybdenum and other strategic metals. The human cargo was perhaps more valuable than all the physical goods combined. 2 Japanese naval officers who had been training in Germany for 2 years were returning home with detailed knowledge of German submarine tactics and technology. They carried microfilm documents containing technical specifications that couldn't be transmitted by radio engineering drawings, metallurgical formulas, and operational data that filled dozens of briefcases locked in the captain's cabin. Commander Kameo Uno, I-52's captain, was selected for this mission specifically because of his experience with long-range operations. At 42 years old, he had commanded submarines for over a decade and had completed 3 trans-Pacific patrols. He understood the challenges of maintaining a submarine's systems during extended deployments far from friendly ports. His crew of 95 men had been hand-picked for their technical skills and reliability, each one aware that this mission would be unlike any they had attempted before. The route planned for I-52 would take her across 15,000 nautical miles of ocean, threading through waters patrolled by Allied forces at every stage. From Kure, she would travel south through the East China Sea, then turn east into the Pacific before swinging around the Cape of Good Hope and up into the Atlantic. The entire journey was expected to take approximately 3 months, with the submarine travelling submerged during daylight hours and surfacing at night to recharge batteries and refresh the air. Provisions loaded aboard I-52 reflected the duration of the mission. The galley was stocked with rice, canned vegetables, dried fish, and enough drinking water to sustain the crew for 100 days. Additional fuel tanks had been installed to extend her range, and every available space was crammed with spare parts, tools and equipment needed to maintain the submarine systems during the long voyage. The crew would live in conditions that grew progressively worse. As the weeks passed, humidity, heat, stale air, and the constant psychological pressure of operating in hostile waters with no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. Before departing, Commander Uno received his sealed orders, to be opened only after leaving Japanese territorial waters. These orders contained the precise coordinates for the mid-Atlantic rendezvous. With U-530, the recognition signals to be exchanged and the contingency plans if the meeting failed to occur. The orders also contained a final directive that Uno shared with no one, ensuring that none of Japan's secrets fell into Allied hands. On the morning of March 10th, 1944, I-52 slipped quietly out of Kure Harbour, her deck awash with the morning tide, her diesels rumbling as she headed into the open ocean. Behind her, the war was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. Ahead lay 15,000 miles of dangerous water and a rendezvous that would never be completed. The plan was audacious in its complexity. I-52 would travel 15,000 miles across the Pacific and around the Cape of Good Hope, surface in the mid-Atlantic on the night of June 23rd, and meet the German submarine U-530 to receive a radar detector and a German pilot who would guide them through the Bay of Biscay's dangerous waters. The rendezvous point had been chosen with meticulous care by German naval strategists. Located at 15 degrees 0, 4N 39 degrees 44W, approximately 850 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands, the coordinates placed the meeting in international waters, far from major shipping lanes and beyond the effective range of most Allied patrol aircraft. The depth at this location exceeded 12,000 feet, making it impossible for submarines to hide on the bottom if attacked, but the open ocean position offered the advantage of distant visibility in all directions. U-530, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Kurt Lang, had departed Lorient, France on May 2nd with specific orders to intercept I-52 and transfer critical equipment. The German submarine carried a Tunis radar detector, a device that could warn of approaching Allied aircraft by detecting their radar emissions. This technology had saved countless German submarines from air attack, and Japanese Naval Command had requested it specifically for I-52's final approach to occupied France, where Allied air patrols were particularly intense. Also aboard U-530 was Oberleutnant Zur. C. Fritz Steinhoff, a German submarine officer who spoke fluent Japanese and had experience navigating the treacherous waters around Brittany. Steinhoff would transfer to I-52 and serve as a pilot, guiding the Japanese submarine through the complex approach to Lorient that required threading between minefields, avoiding known patrol routes, and timing the final surface transit to coincide with the brief windows when German coastal forces could provide air cover. The complexity of coordinating this meeting cannot be overstated. Both submarines had to maintain radio silence for most of their journey to avoid Allied direction finding. The meeting time and location had been agreed upon before either submarine departed, with no possibility of changing the plan if circumstances required. Both commanders had to navigate thousands of miles using celestial navigation and dead reckoning, arriving at the precise coordinates within a specific 4-hour window on the correct date. A navigation error of even a few miles could result in the submarines never finding each other in the vastness of the Atlantic. I-52 made the journey with remarkable precision. She had travelled submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only at night to ventilate the boat and recharge her batteries. The crew endured tropical heat as they crossed the equator, where surface water temperatures exceeded 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the interior of the submarine became a sweltering steel box. They navigated around the Cape of Good Hope, staying well offshore to avoid South African coastal patrols, then turned north into the Atlantic for the final leg of their journey. On June 22nd, one day before the scheduled rendezvous, Commander Uno brought I-52 to the surface at midnight to take star sights and confirm their position. The navigation officer reported they were precisely on schedule, with an estimated arrival at the rendezvous point at 2,200 hours the following evening. The weather forecast was favourable: scattered clouds, moderate seas, visibility good. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan. U-530 arrived at the rendezvous coordinates 3 hours early, surfacing briefly to scan the horizon before diving to periscope depth to wait. The German submarine's hydrophone operator listened carefully for the sound of I-52's propellers, while the radio operator monitored the designated frequency for any communication. At 2,240 hours on June 23rd, the hydrophone operator reported a contact bearing 185 degrees, range approximately 8,000 meters. Captain Lieutenant Lang ordered his submarine to the surface. Through his binoculars, Lang saw I-52 emerge from the darkness, her bow wave phosphorescent in the tropical water, her conning tower silhouetted against the stars. Recognition signals were exchanged using signal lamps, flashes of light in the prearranged sequence that confirmed each submarine's identity. The two vessels maneuvered alongside each other, maintaining a separation of approximately 50 meters, close enough to transfer personnel and equipment, but far enough to avoid collision if the sea conditions changed. The transfer took 45 minutes. Oberleutnant Steinhoff climbed into a small rubber raft with the Tunis radar detector and several waterproof cases containing updated codebooks and operational orders. He was paddled across to I-52, where Japanese sailors helped him aboard and carried the equipment below. Commander Uno and Captain Lieutenant Lange exchanged brief radio messages confirming the successful transfer, wished each other good fortune, and prepared to separate. At 0016 hours on June 24th, both submarines submerged and departed on divergent courses. U-530 headed northeast back toward France, while I-52 set a course that would take her north toward the Bay of Biscay. It was the last time anyone would see I-52 on the surface, but high above in the darkness, someone was watching. At 2,342 hours on June 23rd, 1,944, I-52's radio operator sent a brief encrypted message confirming visual contact with U-530. The German submarine's log recorded the rendezvous in precise detail. Position 15 degrees 0, 4 on the 39 degrees 44. Sea state calm, visibility good. Transfer of personnel and equipment completed without incident. The message was transmitted using a low-power setting, intended to reach only the Japanese Naval communication station in Singapore, which would then relay it to Tokyo. The encryption was handled through the JN-25 Naval code, which Japanese cryptographers believed to be unbreakable. What they didn't know was that American codebreakers had been reading JN-25 traffic for over 2 years, ever since the breakthrough that led to the victory at Midway. Every message I-52 sent was being intercepted, decoded, and analyzed by Allied intelligence within hours of transmission. The decoded message was rushed to the submarine tracking room at the US Navy's headquarters in Washington, where intelligence officers plotted I-52's position on their master chart of the Atlantic. They had been following the submarine's progress for weeks, watching as she rounded the Cape of Good Hope and proceeded north into waters where American hunter-killer groups were actively patrolling. The rendezvous with U-530 had been anticipated. German and Japanese naval messages coordinating the meeting had been intercepted and decoded weeks earlier. Within 3 hours of I-52's transmission, orders were flashed to Carrier Task Group 22.2, operating approximately 600 miles north of the rendezvous point. The escort carrier USS Bogue was directed to launch aircraft to intercept and destroy the Japanese submarine before she could complete her journey to France. Time was critical. If I-52 reached the relative safety of German-controlled waters, she would be protected by air cover and patrol boats that would make an attack far more difficult. At 0245 hours on June 24th, an Avenger torpedo bomber designated Bogue 5 lifted off from the carrier's deck, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Jesse D. Taylor. The aircraft carried 2 Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedoes, a weapon so secret that pilots were forbidden from using them if there was any chance of the device falling into enemy hands. The Mark 24 was designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. Once dropped into the water, near a submerged submarine, it would home in on the propeller noise and detonate on contact. Taylor's aircraft was also equipped with sonobuoys, expendable listening devices that could be dropped into the ocean to detect submarine propeller noise and transmit the acoustic data back to the aircraft via radio. This technology was still relatively new in 1944, but it had proven remarkably effective at locating submerged submarines that would otherwise be invisible beneath the waves. The combination of sonobuoys for detection and acoustic torpedoes for attack made aircraft like Taylor's Avenger far more deadly than the depth-charge-equipped planes of the early war years. The flight to I-52's last known position took approximately 90 minutes. Taylor descended to 500 feet and began dropping sonobuoys in a pattern that would maximize the chance of detecting the submarine if she was anywhere in the area. The acoustic operators in the Avenger's crew compartment monitored the signals transmitted from each sonobuoy, listening through headphones for the distinctive rhythmic thrum of a submarine's propellers. At 0:42 hours, one of the sonobuoys registered a clear contact. The sound signature matched known Japanese submarine acoustics, the slightly higher pitch of I-52's propellers, turning at what appeared to be cruising speed, approximately 7 knots. Taylor banked his aircraft toward the contact location, estimating the submarine's course and speed based on the changing intensity of the signal from multiple sonobuoys. I-52 was running at approximately 150 feet depth, following a northerly course, apparently unaware that she had been detected. The attack procedure was methodical. Taylor flew past the estimated position of the submarine, then circled back to approach from behind, matching his aircraft's speed and heading to the submarine's estimated course. At 0:429 hours, he released his first Mark 24 torpedo, watching as the weapon splashed into the water and disappeared. The torpedo's acoustic seeker activated immediately, listening for propeller noise, adjusting its trajectory based on the sound intensity. 47 seconds after entering the water, the torpedo detonated. The explosion registered on every sonobuoy in the area, a sharp crack followed by the rumbling thunder of a pressure wave traveling through the water. Taylor circled back, watching the ocean surface, waiting for evidence of a kill, an oil slick, debris, air bubbles rising from a damaged hull. In the darkness, with only the moonlight reflecting off the water, it was difficult to see clearly, but his crew reported a growing oil slick beginning to form at the torpedo's impact point. Taylor released his second Mark 24 at 0:434 hours, aiming for the center of the oil slick on the theory that I-52 might still be moving slowly despite the first hit. This second weapon also found its target, detonating 53 seconds after water entry. The sonobuoys recorded the explosion, followed by what one operator described as breaking up noises. The sound of bulkheads collapsing, air escaping, metal tearing as the submarine's hull gave way to the pressure of the surrounding water. Commander Taylor remained in the area for another hour, dropping flares to illuminate the surface and circling at low altitude to document the kill. His after-action report, filed upon returning to the Bogue, noted that a massive oil slick covering approximately 2 square miles had formed at the attack site. No survivors were observed, no debris larger than a few feet across was spotted, and the sonobuoys registered no further mechanical sounds that would indicate a submarine still underway. Based on this evidence, I-52 was officially credited as destroyed, her crew of 95 men and Commander Uno presumed dead. But the truth would prove far more complicated. What neither submarine crew knew was that their radio transmissions had been intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence. High above the rendezvous point, a US Navy Avenger torpedo bomber circled in the darkness, its crew monitoring the submarine's position through newly developed sonobuoys that could detect vessels even when submerged. The aircraft belonged to Composite Squadron 9, a specialized anti-submarine unit operating from the escort carrier USS Bogue. These squadrons represented a revolution in naval warfare, the ability to project air power from small carriers that could accompany convoy routes or actively hunt submarines across vast expanses of ocean. The Bogue herself was a converted merchant ship, her flight deck added as an afterthought to a hull originally designed to carry cargo, but she and her sister ships were proving devastatingly effective against German and Japanese submarines. The crew of the Avenger had been on station for over 4 hours, orbiting at 1,500 feet, in a rectangular pattern that kept them within range of their sonobuoy field while conserving fuel. The pilot, Lieutenant Commander Taylor, had logged over 800 hours in the Avenger and had participated in 3 previous submarine attacks though this would be his first confirmed kill. His radar operator, seated in the aft compartment, monitored a small radar scope that could detect surface submarines at ranges up to 20 miles under ideal conditions. The sonobuoy technology they were using represented one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Each device was essentially a floating microphone connected to a radio transmitter. When dropped into the ocean, the sonobuoy's hydrophone would descend to a predetermined depth, typically 150 feet, and begin listening for submarine propeller noise. Any acoustic energy detected would be converted to a radio signal and transmitted back to the aircraft, where operators could determine not just that a submarine was present, but its approximate bearing and range based on signal strength. What made this technology particularly deadly was that submarines had no way of knowing they were being tracked. Unlike radar, which submarines could detect using receivers, the passive sonobuoys gave off no signal for the submarine to intercept. A submarine crew could believe they were operating in complete stealth, running silent at depth, unaware that aircraft above were tracking their every movement through the water. It was asymmetric warfare at its most effective, the hunter invisible to the hunted until the moment of attack. Taylor's crew had deployed 8 sonobuoys in a pattern that formed a rough circle, 5 miles in diameter, centered on the coordinates where I-52 and U-530 had rendezvoused. The sonobuoys were set to operate for 2 hours before their batteries expired, and they sank, which meant the crew had a limited window to detect and attack any submarine transiting the area. The waiting was the hardest part, circling in the darkness, fuel gauge slowly dropping, knowing that the submarine might have already moved beyond their search area. The breakthrough came at 042, 2 hours, when the number 3 sonobuoy suddenly registered a strong contact. The acoustic operator heard the unmistakable sound of submarine propellers through his headphones, a rhythmic thrumming at approximately 60 revolutions per minute, consistent with a submarine running at 7 knots. He immediately called the contact to Taylor, who banked the aircraft toward the buoy's position and began his attack approach. The tactics for attacking a submerged submarine with acoustic torpedoes had been developed through months of trial and error. The key was to release the weapon ahead of the submarine's position, allowing the torpedo to enter the water and activate its seeker before the target passed by. The Mark 24 torpedo had an effective search range of about 400 yards and could home on propeller noise even in moderate sea conditions, but it needed to be close enough to detect the target before its own propulsion battery expired. Taylor lined up his approach, using updates from the acoustic operator to refine his estimate of I-52's course and speed. The Avenger descended to 300 feet, the optimal altitude for a torpedo drop low enough to ensure accuracy, high enough to avoid the splash and pull away before releasing the second weapon. The crew ran through their pre-attack checklist, arming the torpedoes, opening the bomb bay doors, confirming that all safety interlocks were released. At 0429 hours, Taylor pressed the release button. The first Mark 24 fell away from the aircraft, its fins deploying to stabilize the descent, hitting the water with a splash that was visible even in the darkness. A small parachute retarded the weapon's entry, preventing damage to the delicate acoustic seeker. Once submerged, the torpedo's motor activated, and it began swimming in a circular search pattern. The torpedo's guidance system was remarkably sophisticated for 1944 technology. Electronic circuits compared the sound intensity from port and starboard hydrophones, steering the weapon toward whichever side detected louder propeller noise. As the torpedo closed on its target, the signal grew stronger, allowing the guidance system to refine its approach. There was no defense against this kind of weapon once it locked onto a target. The submarine was doomed unless it could somehow reduce its propeller noise below the torpedo's detection threshold, and that would require stopping completely, which would leave it dead in the water. 47 seconds after the first torpedo entered the water, the explosion lit up the ocean surface. Taylor's crew saw the flash, felt the aircraft shake from the pressure wave transmitted through the air, and knew immediately they had scored a hit. But standard procedure required a follow-up attack to ensure the submarine was destroyed, not merely damaged. As Taylor circled back for his second run, the acoustic operator reported new sounds from the target area: air bubbles, breaking metal, the sounds of a submarine dying. But they would make certain. The pilot of the Avenger, Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor, released his payload at 0016 hours, a pattern of acoustic homing torpedoes designed to track the submarine's propeller signature. His after-action report recorded multiple explosions and a large oil slick, sufficient evidence to claim I-52 as destroyed. The report filed by Taylor upon his return to the USS Bogue was meticulous in its detail, as all combat reports were required to be. He noted the exact time of each torpedo release, the estimated depth of the submarine based on sonobuoy data, the observed results of each explosion, and the final status of the target area when he departed the scene. 2 torpedoes expended, 2 explosions observed, 1 submarine destroyed. The mathematics of war reduced to simple entries in a logbook. The oil slick that Taylor reported was substantial. He estimated it covered at least 2 square miles by the time he departed the area at 0530 hours. In his experience hunting submarines, an oil slick of that size indicated a catastrophic hull breach, likely a ruptured fuel tank or damaged diesel storage. Submarines carried thousands of gallons of fuel, and when that fuel escaped into the ocean, it created slicks that could be visible for days, spreading across the surface until weather and currents finally dispersed it. Debris was sparse, which Taylor noted in his report but didn't find particularly unusual. Submarines sinking in deep water often took most of their contents with them, the pressure at depth compressing everything into the imploding hull. He reported seeing what appeared to be wooden planking, possibly from interior fittings, and several unidentifiable objects that could have been personal effects or equipment. Nothing large enough to conclusively identify as coming from I-52, but enough to corroborate the sonar evidence of a submarine breaking apart. The after-action report was reviewed by the Bogue's air operations officer, who confirmed the kill and forwarded the report up the chain of command. Within 24 hours, I-52 was officially listed as destroyed in the Atlantic submarine tracking charts maintained by Allied intelligence. Her name was crossed off the list of active Japanese submarines, and attention shifted to other threats. From a military standpoint, the matter was closed. 1 more enemy submarine removed from the board, 1 less threat to Allied shipping and operations. But there were details in the acoustic data that didn't quite fit the standard pattern of a submarine kill. The sonobuoy operators who had monitored the attack reported something unusual in the sounds detected after the first torpedo detonation. Along with the expected noises of a damaged submarine air escaping, bulkheads collapsing, metal groaning under pressure, there were other sounds that didn't match their experience from previous attacks. One operator described it as a pulsing tone that lasted for approximately 40 seconds after the first explosion, a sound that oscillated between 220 and 280 hertzes at a regular interval. It wasn't the sound of escaping air, which produced a hissing noise at higher frequencies. It wasn't the sound of collapsing structures, which created lower frequency rumbles and cracks. It was something else entirely. Something that the operator couldn't immediately classify based on his training and experience. Another operator reported hearing what sounded like a brief radio transmission immediately before the second torpedo detonation. The signal lasted only a few seconds and wasn't decoded. It may have been random radio noise, or it may have been an emergency transmission from I-52 attempting to report the attack. The operator noted it in his log but didn't mention it in the verbal debriefing, and the detail was buried in the technical records that were filed away after the mission. The sonobuoy recordings themselves were stored on wire recorders, a relatively new technology that allowed acoustic data to be preserved for later analysis. These recordings were supposed to be maintained for at least 1 year to allow for review if questions arose about the accuracy of kill claims. However, in the chaos of wartime operations, many recordings were reused after only a few weeks. The wire erased and spooled for the next mission. The recordings from I-52's sinking were among those that disappeared into the administrative void. Decades later, when researchers began investigating I-52's loss, they attempted to locate the original acoustic recordings from Taylor's attack. The National Archives had no record of them. The Navy's Historical Center couldn't find them in their collections. The recordings, along with whatever unusual sounds they contained, were gone erased, lost, or possibly classified and buried in files that remained sealed. Without that acoustic evidence, it became impossible to verify or refute the unusual details reported by the sonobuoy operators. One final detail in Taylor's report would later be questioned by researchers. He noted that the oil slick was dark brown in color, with a strong petroleum odor. Japanese submarines typically used a lighter grade of diesel fuel that produced oil slicks with a more amber or yellowish tint. The darker color suggested either contamination with other substances or possibly a different type of fuel altogether. It was a minor discrepancy, easily explained by variations in lighting conditions or fuel composition, but it added to the small collection of details that didn't quite align with the standard narrative. By the time I-52's wreck was discovered in 1995, Lieutenant Commander Taylor had passed away, taking with him any additional details he might have remembered from that night in the Atlantic. The other crew members from his Avenger had scattered across the country after the war, and most were deceased by the 1,990 seconds. The few who were located and interviewed remembered the mission only in broad strokes. They had attacked a submarine, heard explosions, seen an oil slick. Beyond that, the specifics had faded into the general blur of memory that accumulates over 50 years. When deep-sea explorer Paul Tidwell located I-52's wreckage in 1995 using side-scan sonar, what he found contradicted the official account in troubling ways. The submarine sat upright on the ocean floor at 17,000 feet, her hull showing damage inconsistent with torpedo strikes. Tidwell's expedition had spent 3 years planning the search, assembling funding and technology needed to locate a submarine in some of the Atlantic's deepest water. The wreck's approximate location was known from Taylor's after-action report, but approximate, in deep ocean, meant searching hundreds of square miles. The Russian research ship Yuzhmorgologia was equipped with side-scan sonar capable of imaging the seafloor at extreme depths. On August 15th, 1995, after 12 days of systematic searching, the sonar operator called out a contact consistent with a submarine. The image showed a long cylindrical shape, approximately 350 feet in length, with a distinctive conning tower. The submarine was sitting upright rather than lying on its side, as would be expected for a vessel torpedoed and sunk. A remotely operated vehicle descended through 3 miles of water the following day. As it approached the seabed and illuminated the submarine, Tidwell's team knew immediately they had found I-52. The aircraft hangar was distinctive, and the dimensions matched exactly. What surprised them was the hull condition. Instead of catastrophic damage from 2 torpedo hits, the submarine showed what appeared to be relatively minor damage to the portside aft section. A hole approximately 6 feet in diameter had edges bent inward, consistent with external explosion, but this single breach seemed insufficient to sink a submarine designed to withstand considerable combat damage. The forward torpedo tubes were closed, the deck gun remained mounted, the conning tower hatch was secured. Every external indicator suggested I-52 had been operating normally when whatever happened occurred. The depth itself was puzzling. At 17,000 feet, water pressure exceeded 7,500 pounds per square inch. A torpedoed submarine typically plummets to the bottom rapidly, yet the lack of impact crater suggested a gradual descent, as if the submarine maintained some buoyancy control even after fatal damage. The ROV examined the hull breach closely. Located just aft of the battery compartment in an area housing fuel and trim tanks, an explosion here would have been serious but not immediately catastrophic. The pressure hull remained intact, and watertight doors should have prevented flooding from spreading. The crew would have had time to surface and potentially abandon ship, yet there was no evidence I-52 had surfaced after the torpedo hit. Taylor's report mentioned no periscope or conning tower breaking the surface. The oil slick suggested fuel escaping gradually as the submarine sank, not the sudden release accompanying an emergency surface with major hull breach. One detail particularly troubled Tidwell: the absence of a debris field. When submarines break apart during descent, they shed components across wide areas. Around I-52, there was almost nothing, just a few metal fragments. The submarine sat alone on the empty seabed, her condition suggesting a story far more complex than the official reports indicated. Tidwell's remote-operated vehicles photographed the wreck extensively, documenting every detail of the submarine's final resting place. But when his team finally gained access to the cargo hold where 2 tons of gold should have been stored, they found the compartment completely empty. The discovery came during the expedition's 3rd day at the wreck site. The ROV had been systematically documenting each section when it reached the aft cargo compartment, where Japanese records indicated the gold had been stowed. This reinforced section was designed to carry heavy cargo without affecting the submarine's trim. Access required examining the compartment through damaged hull plating that had been peeled back during the submarine's descent. The ROV's cameras illuminated the interior, revealing nothing. No gold bars, no wooden crates, no packing materials. The compartment appeared stripped clean. The manifest was precise. 146 gold bars, each measuring 12 inches long, 2 inches wide, 1 inch thick, weighing 20 kilograms each. Total weight, 2 tons. The bars had been packed in 49 metal boxes with rubber padding to prevent shifting during rough seas. The compartment was designed to hold cargo securely even in severe conditions. It seemed physically impossible for the gold to have simply fallen out. The damaged hull section was too small for cargo boxes to pass through. Even if boxes had broken open, 146 gold bars weighing 20 kilograms each couldn't vanish. Gold is extraordinarily dense. It doesn't float, dissolve, or deteriorate. Tidwell's team spent hours examining the compartment, using the ROV's manipulator arm to probe accumulated sediment. They found nothing. No glint of metal, no edge of crate, no indication cargo had ever been there. The tungsten cargo was equally absent. 54 tons of tungsten ingots should have been stored in the forward hold, stacked and secured with steel straps. Tungsten doesn't corrode in seawater and has such a high melting point that no natural ocean process could destroy it. Yet the forward cargo hold was also empty. Several theories emerged. Perhaps I-52 had been secretly unloaded before the Atlantic crossing, though this raised questions about why the submarine would continue her dangerous mission with no cargo to deliver. Another theory suggested the cargo had been jettisoned after the torpedo attack to reduce weight, but moving 2 tons of gold and 54 tons of tungsten seemed logistically impossible in the brief window before sinking. More disturbing was the theory that I-52 had been boarded after initial damage, her cargo removed before the submarine was scuttled. This would explain both missing cargo and the intact hull, but no Allied surface vessels were recorded in the area, and Taylor's report mentioned no support ships. The compartment securing mechanisms, metal rings and chains for lashing cargo remained in place, properly secured to the deck, but attached to nothing. If cargo had been jettisoned, these should show evidence of hasty release. Instead, everything appeared orderly, secured, and empty, as if the cargo had dematerialized. To this day, 2 tons of gold and 54 tons of tungsten remain unaccounted for, disappeared somewhere between Kure Harbour and the ocean floor. Some disappearances are more disturbing because of where they occur rather than where they don't. I-56 was operating in waters so familiar to her crew that they could navigate them. Blindfolded the approaches to Kure Naval Base, less than 20 miles from where most of them had grown up. The inland sea of Japan was as close to safe operating area as submarines could find in spring 1945. Protected by islands, the relatively shallow waters had been Japan's primary naval anchorage for centuries. Every depth, current, and navigation hazard had been precisely charted. I-56 had completed 7 war patrols before returning to Kure for overhaul in March 1945. Her crew of 97 were among the most experienced in the fleet, with several officers having survived previous submarine sinkings. The patrol orders issued April 15th were straightforward. Depart Kure at dawn April 18th. Proceed south through Bungo Channel into the Pacific. Conduct submerged approach exercises with a patrol boat, then return by nightfall. The entire patrol would keep I-56 within 60 miles of Kure, in constantly patrolled waters. Commander Masahiko Morinaga filed departure notification at 0545 hours, April 18th, confirming all systems operational. Weather forecast predicted clear skies and calm seas, with visibility exceeding 10 miles, ideal conditions for surface transit and submerged operations. I-56 departed at 0600 hours, maneuvering through the crowded anchorage where dozens of vessels lay at anchor. Observers watched her pass, noting the time in the harbour master's log. The submarine proceeded down the channel at 5 knots, diesels rumbling as she headed toward Hiroshima Bay. The last confirmed sighting came at 0635 hours from a coastal defence station on Etajima Island. The observer recorded the submarine passing the island's southern tip, still on surface, maintaining southerly course. The log notation was brief. I-56 southbound, normal operations. When I-56 failed to return by 1800 hours, the duty officer wasn't immediately concerned. Training exercises sometimes ran long, and radio silence was standard, but when darkness fell with no submarine, concern grew. At 2,100 hours, the harbour master attempted radio contact on emergency frequencies. No response. By midnight, I-56 was 6 hours overdue and had missed her scheduled check-in. Naval Command ordered coastal stations to report any sightings. Patrol boats were dispatched to search the training area. They found nothing. No submarine on surface, no emergency signals, no flares. The search expanded at dawn April 19th, with aircraft joining surface vessels combing waters where I-56 should have been conducting exercises. They searched Bungo Channel, Hiroshima Bay approaches, and coastal waters south of Shikoku. Divers investigated sonar contacts, but each proved to be rocky outcroppings or old wrecks unrelated to I-56. The patrol boat assigned to conduct exercises reported I-56. The boat waited 3 hours, scanning horizons and monitoring radios. But I-56 never surfaced, never made contact, never appeared. In the brief window between 06:35 hours and scheduled exercise time at 09:00 hours, less than 2.5 hours, I-56 disappeared, completely in familiar waters, good weather, with experienced crew. There were no enemy forces, no unusual conditions, nothing explaining how a submarine could vanish so thoroughly in such short time. April 1945 found the Imperial Japanese Navy in desperate straits. Their surface fleet shattered, their carriers sunk, their empire shrinking by the day. Submarines like I-56 were among the few offensive weapons they had left, and every patrol mattered, even the supposedly safe training exercises close to home. The naval situation by spring 1945 was catastrophic. Leyte Gulf had destroyed Japan's capacity for large-scale surface operations. Yamato and Musashi were gone, along with most carriers and cruisers. American submarines had strangled merchant shipping, cutting supply lines for oil and raw materials. The once mighty combined fleet was reduced to scattered vessels hiding in harbours. In this context, submarines represented one of the few ways Japan could still strike enemy forces. They operated independently, didn't require massive support infrastructure, and could potentially inflict significant damage on American supply lines. But by 1945, the submarine force was also declining. Dozens had been lost to American anti-submarine warfare, and construction couldn't keep pace with losses. This made the decision to conduct training exercises with I-56 somewhat controversial. Some officers argued submarines should be deployed on combat patrols, even if crews weren't fully trained. Every training day was a day not attacking the enemy. Others maintained poorly trained crews were more likely lost to operational accidents than enemy action, and training standards were essential for survival. I-56's training exercise was designed to verify systems installed during her overhaul were functioning correctly. The submarine had spent 6 weeks in the yard where technicians repaired damage, replaced worn equipment, and upgraded several systems. Standard procedure required shakedown cruises, ensuring everything worked before combat operations. The crew had been partially rotated during overhaul. 15 men transferred to other boats or shore assignments, replaced by sailors fresh from submarine school. These new crew members needed integration with the existing team. Learning I-56's specific procedures and developing instinctive coordination. The training patrol would allow officers to evaluate new men under operating conditions, identify problems, and correct them before missions, where mistakes would be fatal. Commander Morinaga personally reviewed every aspect of the training plan. Exercises would begin with basic submarine handling, diving and surfacing drills, trim adjustments, emergency procedures. Then they'd practice approach and attack maneuvers with the patrol boat, simulating combat without actual risk. Finally, high-speed surface transit back to Kure would test diesel engines under full load. The entire evolution should take approximately 10 hours with generous safety margins. Weather forecast was checked multiple times before departure. No storms predicted, no fog, no conditions complicating the exercise. Sea state expected to remain calm, with winds under 10 knots and waves under 3 feet. Visibility would be excellent, allowing surface operations with minimal risk of surprise by aircraft. The submarine's material condition had been verified by Engineering Officer Lieutenant Yamada, who certified all systems operational and ready for sea. Diesel engines test ran at the pier showing normal performance. Battery was fully charged and load tested. Diving and trim systems checked with all valves and pumps within specifications. Every checklist item completed and signed off. As I-56 cast off and maneuvered into the channel, everything appeared normal. Engines ran smoothly. Control surfaces responded properly. Crew performed duties with practiced efficiency. Commander Morinaga reviewed the chart one final time, confirming planned route and checkpoints. Everything proceeded exactly according to plan, but in less than 3 hours, I-56 would cease to exist, vanishing so completely that decades of searching would fail to explain what happened in those familiar waters so close to home. Fishermen working the waters off Kure on the morning of April 18th reported seeing a strange fog bank rolling in from the south, dense and yellowish in colour, moving against the wind in a way that seemed to defy the normal patterns they'd observed for decades. The fishermen who reported the unusual fog were experienced men, some having worked the inland sea for 40 years. They knew weather patterns intimately when fog formed, how it moved with winds and currents, what colour it should be under different conditions. The fog they observed violated every pattern they understood. Takeshi Nakamura, captain of fishing boat Kayun Maru, provided the most detailed account. Working his nets approximately 5 miles south of Etajima Island, he noticed fog approaching from the southeast at approximately 0700 hours. What struck him first was its colour. Not normal white or grey, but pale yellowish tint, reminiscent of sulphur smoke. Though no refineries existed in that direction, the fog's movement was equally strange. Wind was blowing from northwest at 8 knots, yet fog moved directly against wind, travelling northwest toward Hiroshima Bay. Nakamura watched it approach for several minutes, puzzled by the apparent impossibility. Fog banks don't move against wind, they're carried by air currents, passive and responsive to atmospheric pressure. As fog drew closer, Nakamura noticed another unusual characteristic: distinct boundaries, almost like a wall rather than diffuse edges typical of fog. The leading edge was remarkably sharp, a clear demarcation between normal visibility and complete obscurity. He could see 2 miles in every direction until reaching the fog bank, where visibility dropped to 0 within meters. When fog reached his position at 0720 hours, Nakamura experienced something that troubled him enough to immediately turn toward port. Temperature dropped suddenly. He estimated at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit within a minute. Air became thick and difficult to breathe, with acrid smell burning his nostrils and watering his eyes. His compass began spinning erratically, needle swinging wildly without settling. Most disturbing was the sound. Inside the fog, all normal sounds became muffled and distant, as if heard through heavy cloth. His boat's engine rumble, normally quite loud, became almost inaudible. Seabird cries disappeared entirely. Instead, there was low humming, oscillating in pitch between something felt in the chest and something barely audible. Nakamura described it as similar to high-tension electrical wires, but deeper and more pervasive. The fog lasted approximately 20 minutes, before moving on northwest, maintaining sharp boundaries and steady progress against wind. As it passed, temperature returned to normal, compass steadied, oppressive thickness dissipated. Nakamura checked his watch. It had stopped at 072, 2 hours, the exact moment fog enveloped his vessel. When reset after returning to port, the watch ran normally. 3 other fishing boats reported similar experiences. Each captain described the same yellowish colour, sharp boundaries, temperature drop, and compass malfunction. 2 reported watches stopping. All agreed the experience was unsettling enough to curtail fishing and return to port early. Meteorological records from Kure Naval Air Station showed clear skies and excellent visibility that morning. With no fog reported by official observation stations, Weather Officer noted light winds from northwest, humidity at 65%, high-pressure system conditions that don't typically produce fog. One detail emerged during investigation: timing and location of fog reports. Plotting sightings on a chart showed fog moved through exact area where I-56 should have been transiting between 0700 and 0730 hours, based on departure time and planned route. Last confirmed sighting was 0635 hours. I-56 was never seen again. The correlation between Fogg's passage and Submarine's disappearance was noted but never officially explained. A lighthouse keeper stationed on a small island near the Submarine's patrol route gave a statement to naval investigators that was later buried in classified files. He claimed to have seen I-56 on the surface just before dawn, her deck crew visible through his telescope, when the strange fog rolled over her position. Kenji Yoshida had been tending the lighthouse on Kurahashi Island for 12 years, keeping the light burning through countless nights while watching vessels pass through the channel. His logbook recorded every ship that transited his area, noting the time and direction with meticulous precision. On the morning of April 18th, he logged I-56's passage at 0638 hours, 3 minutes after the Coastal Defense Station's sighting. Through his telescope, Yoshida watched the submarine proceeding south at moderate speed, her conning tower clearly visible against the dark water. He could make out crew members on the bridge, at least 3 figures scanning the horizon. Everything appeared normal. The submarine was traveling on the surface as planned, making good time toward her exercise area. At approximately 0710 hours, Yoshida observed the yellowish fog bank approaching from the southeast. He noted it in his log as unusual weather phenomenon, color and movement pattern abnormal. He watched through his telescope as the fog moved toward I-56's position, estimating it would overtake the submarine within 10 to 15 minutes based on their relative speeds and courses. What happened next formed the core of Yoshida's statement to investigators. As the fog reached I-56's position, he kept his telescope focused on the submarine, curious to see if she would dive to avoid the poor visibility. Instead, the submarine continued on the surface, disappearing into the fog bank. For approximately 5 minutes, Yoshida could see nothing but the dense yellowish haze where I-56 had been. Then the fog began to thin slightly, and Yoshida caught a brief glimpse of something that made no sense. Through a gap in the fog, he saw what appeared to be I-56's conning tower, but the submarine seemed to be at a different angle, as if she were standing nearly vertical in the water. The image lasted only a few seconds before the fog closed in again, and when it finally cleared 10 minutes later, there was no sign of the submarine anywhere. Yoshida immediately reported what he'd seen to the naval station, but his account was met with skepticism. Submarines don't stand on end in the water. It was physically impossible given their design and buoyancy characteristics. Investigators suggested he had seen a trick of light through the fog, a distorted image caused by unusual atmospheric refraction. His testimony was noted, but ultimately dismissed as unreliable optical effects. Yet Yoshida maintained his account until his death in 1967, insisting that he had seen something that defied explanation. His logbook, preserved in the lighthouse archives, confirms the timeline and his observations about the fog. The entry for 0725 hours reads simply, I-56 lost from sight in fog. Did not emerge. 3 days after I-56's disappearance, a Japanese minesweeper working in the same area reported their hydrophone operator picking up unusual sounds from deep water. Not the groaning of a damaged hull or the hiss of escaping air, but something the operator described as rhythmic and metallic, like a clock ticking underwater. The minesweeper Natsushima had been assigned to search the area where I-56 had last been seen, dragging hydrophones through the water while slowly traversing a grid pattern. The hydrophone, essentially an underwater microphone, could detect sounds at considerable distances, allowing operators to hear submarines, ships, or other acoustic sources that would be invisible on the surface. At 1,430 hours on April 21st, Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka was monitoring the hydrophones when he detected an unusual acoustic signature bearing approximately 180 degrees true. The sound wasn't continuous. It pulsed at regular intervals, approximately once every 2 seconds. Tanaka described it as similar to metal striking metal, but with a hollow quality that suggested the source was inside a resonant chamber. The pattern was remarkably consistent. 2 distinct taps, a pause of precisely 2 seconds, then 2 more taps. The sequence repeated without variation for 17 minutes, before gradually fading and disappearing entirely. Tanaka recorded the bearing and estimated range as approximately 2,000 meters, placing the source in water that was roughly 400 feet deep, according to their charts. The minesweeper's captain altered course to investigate, steaming toward the bearing where the sounds had been detected. When they arrived at the estimated position, the hydrophones detected nothing but the normal ambient noise of the ocean water movement, distant shipping, biological sounds from marine life. Whatever had been making the tapping sound had gone silent. A second minesweeper, Shikine, was directed to the location to conduct a more thorough search. Her sonar swept the area repeatedly but detected no solid contacts consistent with a submarine hull on the bottom. Divers were considered, but the depth exceeded safe limits for the equipment available. The source of the sounds remained unidentified. Several theories were proposed. The tapping could have been debris from I-56 settling on the seabed, metal components contracting as they cooled in the cold water. It could have been a damaged air tank releasing pressure in rhythmic bursts. Some suggested it might have been survivors trapped in an air pocket, using metal tools to signal their location, 2 taps repeated at regular intervals, being a distress signal used by submarines worldwide. If survivors were signaling, the 17-minute duration suggested they had limited time. A submarine compartment at 400 feet depth would be under crushing pressure, and any air pockets would be rapidly consumed by trapped crew members. The fact that the sound stopped and never resumed suggested whatever was happening had reached its conclusion. 18. Position reports are supposed to tell you where a vessel is. But when I-370 transmitted her location on the evening of July 14th, 1945, the coordinates she provided placed her in waters that should have been impossible for her to reach. The transmission came through clearly at 2047 hours, decoded by the communications station at Ominato Naval Base on the northern tip of Honshu. I-370 reported her position as 52 degrees, 1570, 175 degrees, 30, approximately 400 miles west of Attu Island in the Aleutian chain. The coordinates were transmitted twice for confirmation, eliminating the possibility of a simple transcription error. The problem was immediately apparent to the duty officer reviewing the message. According to I-370's previous position report filed 18 hours earlier, the submarine had been operating near the Mariana Islands at 15 degrees, 20 N, 145 degrees, 45 E. The distance between these two positions was approximately 2,800 nautical miles, a journey that would require continuous travel at over 150 knots, more than 7 times I-370's maximum surface speed. Even if I-370 had abandoned her patrol area immediately after the previous report, and somehow maintained her absolute maximum speed of 23 knots on the surface for 18 consecutive hours, she could have covered only 414 nautical miles. The reported position was simply impossible, unless the laws of physics had been suspended or I-370 had discovered a means of instantaneous transportation. The communications officer contacted I-370 by radio, requesting clarification of her position report and asking if there had been a navigation error. The submarine's response, received 45 minutes later, confirmed the coordinates and added that the position had been verified by celestial navigation using star sights taken at twilight. The navigation officer's confidence was evident in the wording. He stated the position was accurate within 5 nautical miles. Naval Command faced a dilemma. Either I-370's navigation officer had made a catastrophic error in calculating their position, or something inexplicable had occurred. The submarine's commander, Captain Tanaka, was known for his competence and attention to detail. His navigation officer had graduated at the top of his class. Neither seemed likely to make an error of such magnitude. Additional messages were exchanged over the next 2 hours. I-370 provided detailed information about water temperature, depth soundings, and visual observations of the surrounding area, all consistent with the Aleutian position rather than the Mariana Islands. The water temperature of 48 degrees Fahrenheit matched the expected temperature for the Aleutians, not the tropical 82 degrees Fahrenheit of the Marianas. Depth soundings showed 600 fathoms, consistent with charts of the Aleutian region. The final message from I-370 that night reported that the crew was experiencing disorientation and confusion. Several men reported severe headaches and memory gaps. The captain requested permission to return to port for medical evaluation. Naval Command approved the request and ordered I-370 to proceed to Paramushia Island in the Kurils, the nearest Japanese-controlled base. I-370 never arrived. No further transmissions were received, and the submarine failed to appear at any port. Search efforts focused on the Aleutian area, where she had reported her position, but found nothing. 3 weeks later, Japan surrendered, and the search was abandoned. According to her previous position report filed 18 hours earlier, I-370 had been operating near the Mariana Islands, approximately 1,400 nautical miles from the coordinates she now claimed to occupy near the Aleutian chain. Even at maximum surface speed, the distance couldn't be covered in that time. The mathematics of the situation were unambiguous. I-370 was a Type B-1 submarine with a maximum surface speed of 23.6 knots when running both diesel engines at full power. Her submerged speed was considerably slower, only 8 knots maximum, using battery power, and that speed could only be maintained for 1 hour before the batteries would require recharging. Naval architects who reviewed the case calculated various scenarios. If I-370 had somehow maintained her absolute maximum surface speed for the entire 18-hour period, between position reports and impossibility given fuel consumption, engine cooling requirements, and crew endurance, she could have travelled 424.8 nautical miles. That would place her roughly 160 miles north of her previous position, nowhere near the Aleutian Islands. Even theoretical scenarios involving favourable currents couldn't explain the distance. The North Pacific Current flows west to east at approximately 1 to 2 knots in that region. If I-370 had somehow caught the most favourable current and maintained maximum speed with the current pushing her, she might have gained an additional 30 to 40 miles, still far short of the 2,800 miles needed. Some investigators suggested I-370 might have been transported by a surface vessel, loaded aboard a fast cargo ship or naval transport that carried her north while she remained on the surface or semi-submerged. However, no such vessels were recorded as operating in that area, and the logistics of loading a 2,200-ton submarine onto another ship would have been extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible with the equipment available in 1945. The possibility of a navigation error couldn't be entirely dismissed, but the error would have been unprecedented. Navigation officers used celestial sights taken with sextants, calculating their position by measuring angles between celestial bodies and the horizon. Errors in these calculations were usually small, a few miles at most, if the officer made a mistake in the mathematical reduction of the sights. An error of 2,800 miles would require multiple catastrophic mistakes compounded by equipment failure. I-370's transmission included a description of sea conditions and weather that investigators tried to verify against meteorological records. The submarine reported scattered clouds, moderate seas, and visibility approximately 8 miles. Weather records from both regions showed that the Mariana Islands had been experiencing tropical squalls that day, while the Aleutians had indeed experienced the conditions I-370 described. This corroborated that I-370 was actually in the northern location, not confused about where they were. The submarine also reported observing land masses consistent with islands in the Aleutian chain. The navigator specifically mentioned seeing mountainous terrain to the east, which would match Attu Island, but would have no correlation to anything visible from the Mariana Islands. Either the entire crew was experiencing a shared hallucination, or they were genuinely where they claimed to be. One final piece of evidence came from radio direction finding. Allied stations had been monitoring Japanese naval communications throughout the war, using triangulation to determine the source location of transmissions. An American signals intelligence report from that date noted intercepting a Japanese submarine transmission originating from approximately 52 degrees north, 175 degrees east, exactly the position I-370 had reported. The Americans had no knowledge of the previous position report or the impossibility of the journey. What made the report even stranger was the water temperature data included in the transmission. Standard procedure required submarines to report sea temperature at their current depth, information that helped headquarters track ocean currents and thermal layers that might affect sonar detection. I-370's report included a water temperature reading of 48.2 degrees Fahrenheit at their current depth of 150 feet. This single piece of data was perhaps the most compelling evidence that something extraordinary had occurred, because water temperature was not something a confused navigation officer could simply invent or miscalculate. It was a direct physical measurement taken with a thermometer mounted on the submarine's hull. The waters around the Mariana Islands, where I-370 had been 18 hours earlier, he maintained a consistent temperature of 8 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface and approximately 78-80 degrees Fahrenheit at 150 feet depth. The tropical location meant the water remained warm year-round with minimal variation. These temperature ranges were well documented in naval charts and oceanographic surveys. In contrast, the waters of the Aleutian chain showed dramatically different temperatures. Surface water in mid-July averaged 5 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping to 46-50 degrees Fahrenheit at depth as the cold water from the Arctic mixed with the North Pacific. The temperature reading I-370, reported 48.2 degrees Fahrenheit, fell precisely within the expected range for the Aleutian position and was completely inconsistent with any location near the Mariana Islands. Temperature measurements were taken multiple times during a patrol, with readings recorded in the engineering log. The thermometer was a simple mechanical device mounted externally on the hull with a readout inside the submarine. There was no way to falsify the reading short of physically tampering with the instrument. The engineering officer who recorded the temperature would have noticed if the reading was dramatically wrong, as he monitored temperature data to calculate water density for trim calculations. The implication was profound. I-370's hull was actually in contact with 48-degree water, meaning the submarine was physically present in a northern location. The temperature reading couldn't be explained by navigation errors, confusion, or misidentification of landmarks. A thermometer doesn't lie about the temperature of the water surrounding it. Investigators searched for alternative explanations. Could an underwater current carry warm water north or cold water south, creating temperature anomalies? While ocean currents do transport water masses over long distances, the temperature differential was too extreme and the change too rapid. No known current could account for a submarine experiencing a 30-degree temperature drop in 18 hours while theoretically remaining in the same general region. Could the thermometer have malfunctioned, giving a false reading? This seemed unlikely since the instrument was mechanical and had no electronic components to fail. Additionally, the crew would have noticed other indicators of cold water. The hull would have been cold to the touch. Condensation would have formed inside the submarine as warm interior air contacted the cold metal, and the crew would have felt the temperature difference. The engineering log entry that accompanied the temperature reading noted significant interior condensation dropped. These observations were consistent with a submarine in cold northern waters, not tropical southern waters. Naval investigators initially assumed I-370's navigation officer had made an error, perhaps misreading the sextant during a position fix or transposing numbers when encoding the transmission. Compasses could malfunction, charts could be misread, and exhausted crews could make mistakes. The compass malfunction theory was attractive because it offered a rational explanation that didn't require accepting impossible scenarios. If I-370's magnetic compass had been affected by some anomaly, perhaps a nearby deposit of magnetite on the ocean floor or damage to the compass binnacle itself, the navigation officer might have calculated an incorrect course. Over 18 hours, even a few degrees of error could result in the submarine being significantly off course. Japanese submarines carried two independent compass systems. The magnetic compass was the primary navigation tool, a traditional device that aligned itself with Earth's magnetic field. The gyro compass was a more sophisticated instrument that used a rapidly spinning wheel to maintain orientation based on Earth's rotation rather than its magnetic field. The two systems served as checks against each other. If they showed different headings, navigators knew something was wrong. Investigators requested that I-370 confirm both compass readings in a follow-up transmission. The submarine reported that the magnetic compass and gyro compass agreed within 1 degree, both indicating a heading that was consistent with their reported position in the Aleutians. If both compasses were giving the same reading, it seemed unlikely that a compass error was the explanation. The theory that charts might have been misread was equally problematic. Navigation charts of the Pacific were standardized and clearly marked with latitude and longitude grids. A navigation officer would need to misread his position by over 20 degrees of latitude, an error that would be immediately obvious when plotting the position on a chart. The islands of the Mariana Chain and the Aleutian Chain look nothing alike on a navigation chart, making misidentification virtually impossible. Sextant errors were considered, but also seemed implausible. A sextant measures angles between celestial bodies and the horizon to calculate position. The most common errors involve misidentifying stars or making arithmetic mistakes in the calculations. But such errors typically result in position uncertainties of 10 or 20 miles, not thousands of miles. To miscalculate by 2,800 miles would require the navigator to use completely wrong stars or make calculation errors that would be caught when checking the math. The exhaustion and stress theory suggested that I-370's entire navigation team might have been so fatigued that they collectively made multiple errors that compounded into the impossible position report. However, submarine crews maintained strict watch rotations specifically to prevent exhaustion-related errors. The navigation officer, assistant navigator, and quartermaster of the watch were all trained to verify each other's work. The likelihood of all three making the same massive error simultaneously was vanishingly small. What troubled investigators most was that I-370's crew seemed confident in their position. There was no indication in their transmissions that they suspected any navigation error. The captain didn't request assistance, verifying their position, or express any doubt about where they were. The tone of the communications suggested a crew that knew exactly where they were and was confused about how they had gotten there, rather than a crew confused about their location. When the war ended 3 weeks later, Allied forces began the massive task of accounting for Japanese naval assets. I-370 was listed among the submarines to be located and either scuttled or claimed as war prizes. Her last reported position noted in the files sent to recovery teams. The surrender of Japan on August 15th, 1945, triggered Operation Corkscrew, the Allied program to locate and secure Japanese submarines. Many boats had received orders to surrender in place and await Allied boarding parties. Others had been scuttled by their crews to prevent capture. The Allies needed to account for every submarine to ensure none remained operational or fell into unauthorized hands. I-370's case file included both reported positions, the Mariana Islands location from July 13th and the Aleutian location from July 14th. Recovery teams were instructed to search both areas, though the Aleutian position was considered more likely since it was the submarine's last reported location. American naval vessels were dispatched to conduct surface searches, while submarines were sent to investigate possible wrecks detected by sonar. The search of the Aleutian area began in September 1945, focusing on the waters around the coordinates I-370 had transmitted. The searchers found several sonar contacts that initially appeared promising large metal objects on the seafloor that could potentially be a submarine. Each contact was investigated, with divers sent down where depth permitted or underwater cameras deployed in deeper water. One wreck found at 52 degrees, 18 N 175 degrees, 42 E. Within 12 miles of I-370's reported position initially seemed like a strong candidate. The sonar image showed a submarine-sized object at 450 feet depth. However, when investigators examined the wreck more closely, they identified it as an American submarine, USS Grunion, which had been lost in the area in 1942. The discovery helped solve one mystery but provided no information about I-370. The search expanded to cover a wider area, operating on the theory that I-370 might have been damaged and drifted from her reported position before sinking. Search vessels covered over 5,000 square nautical miles of ocean, investigating every significant sonar contact. They found fishing vessels, merchant ships, and military craft from various nations, but no trace of I-370. A parallel search was conducted in the Mariana Islands area, operating on the possibility that I-370 had never actually reached the Aleutians and her position report had been completely erroneous. This search also found nothing conclusive. Several wrecks were located, but none matched I-370's characteristics. The waters around the Marianas were busy during the war years, with numerous vessels lost in the fighting, making it difficult to identify specific wrecks without detailed examination. By December 1945, both searches were scaled back as resources were redirected to other priorities. I-370 was officially classified as lost, location unknown in Allied records. Japanese naval records also listed her as missing. with her fate undetermined. The submarine had effectively vanished, leaving only the impossible position reports as evidence of her final days. Over the years, occasional reports surfaced of wreckage that might be I-370, but none were confirmed. In 1968, a fishing trawler snagged its nets on an obstruction near the Aleutian position, bringing up metal fragments that could have come from a submarine. Analysis showed the metal was consistent with Japanese naval construction of the 1,940 but without more substantial wreckage, positive identification was impossible. 23. In the strange accounting of war, some vessels are recorded as sunk multiple times, victims of overclaimed kills and mistaken identity. But I-12 presents a different puzzle she appears in. Casualty reports from two locations over 3,000 miles apart, both claims supported by evidence that seems impossible to reconcile. The existence of two seemingly credible sinking reports for I-12 created an administrative nightmare for post-war naval historians. Unlike cases where multiple ships claimed the same kill, these were separate incidents occurring over 2 months apart in completely different operational theatres. Both reports came from reliable sources with supporting evidence, yet both couldn't simultaneously be correct. The complication was compounded by the fact that I-12 had no sister ships with similar identification numbers that might have been confused. Japanese submarine numbering was systematic and sequential, with each boat receiving a unique designation. I-11 and I-13 were accounted for separately in naval records, eliminated as possible sources of confusion. Whatever was being sunk in these two incidents, at least one of them wasn't I-12 or something far stranger was occurring. Japanese records added to the confusion rather than resolving it. The submarine's departure from Kure on October 15th, 1944 was well documented, with orders sending her to patrol the waters off the Philippines in support of the Leyte Gulf operation. Her assignment was to intercept American supply vessels supporting the landings, a mission that would keep her in Philippine waters through November and potentially December. Yet I-12 also appeared in a separate operational order dated December 1944, directing her to patrol waters near New Guinea over 1,500 miles from the Philippines. How could a submarine be assigned to two different patrol areas separated by thousands of miles? Either the paperwork was wrong, or I-12 had somehow completed her Philippine mission, returned to Japan, been reassigned, and departed again without any record of the intermediate port visit. The personnel records were equally confusing. Some crew members listed as assigned to I-12 appeared in casualty reports from the November sinking. Others appeared in reports from the January sinking. A few appeared in both. It was as if I-12's crew had been split between two different vessels, or the administrative tracking of personnel had become so confused that records were simply unreliable. American intelligence files added another layer of mystery. The submarine tracking charts maintained by Allied forces showed I-12 as probably sunk after the November incident, but continued to show her as active on updated charts produced in December and early January. The intelligence analysts had apparently received information suggesting I-12 had survived the first attack and remained operational, though the source of that intelligence was never clearly documented. Radio intercepts from January 1945 included decoded messages that mentioned a submarine with a designation that could be interpreted as I-12, operating near New Guinea. The intercepts were fragmentary and the translation uncertain. They provided enough information that Allied forces took the reports seriously and organised anti-submarine patrols in the area. This suggested that either I-12 had survived or another submarine was being misidentified. The dual mystery of I-12 remained unresolved in post-war investigations. Both sinking claims remained in official records, with notations indicating uncertainty about which, if either, was accurate. The submarine was listed in Japanese casualty reports as lost November 1944, circumstances disputed, and also as possibly lost January 1945. For families of the crew, this ambiguity meant never knowing when or where their loved ones had died, adding painful uncertainty to their grief. On November 13th, 1944, the USS Haggard and USS Franks reported engaging a surfaced Japanese submarine off the coast of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. Their action reports described a textbook attack. Radar contact at 2,200 yards, visual confirmation of a surface submarine, gunfire exchanged before the submarine crash dived, followed by a devastating depth charge pattern. The engagement began at 0314 hours, when Haggard's radar operator detected a surface contact bearing 045 degrees at 2,200 yards range. The destroyer was conducting an anti-submarine patrol as part of the defensive screen protecting American forces landing on Leyte. The radar signature was consistent with a submarine on the surface, moving slowly and showing no indication it had detected the approaching destroyers. Commander William McCormack ordered Haggard to general quarters and increased speed to 20 knots, maneuvering to close the range, while USS Franks, positioned 3 miles to the east, also turned toward the contact. The two destroyers coordinated their approach by radio, planning to trap the submarine between them and prevent escape. The first salvo of 5-inch shells bracketed the submarine, with at least one round striking the conning tower. In the darkness, McCormack could see the distinctive silhouette of a Japanese submarine against the phosphorescent water. Her deck gun unmanned, her hatches apparently sealed, the submarine immediately began a crash dive, disappearing beneath the surface within 40 seconds of the first shell impact. Haggard's sonar operator acquired the submarine at 0318 hours, tracking it as it descended rapidly toward 300 feet depth. The submarine was running at approximately 15 knots on a heading that would take it toward deeper water, attempting to escape the immediate danger zone. McCormack calculated the submarine's course and speed, positioning Haggard for a depth charge attack. At 0321 hours, Haggard rolled a pattern of 8 depth charges set to detonate at 250 and 350 feet. The explosions lit up the water with columns of spray. The shockwaves felt on the destroyer's deck as thunderous booms. Sonar contact was temporarily lost in the turbulence, but the operator reported breaking up noises, consistent with a submarine suffering structural damage. USS Franks arrived at 0328 hours and conducted a second depth charge attack, dropping 11 charges in a wider pattern to catch the submarine if it had managed to maneuver after the first attack. The sonar operators on both destroyers reported no mechanical sounds after this second pattern. No propellers, no machinery noise. Nothing to indicate a submarine still under power. At daybreak, both destroyers conducted a surface search of the attack area. They found a large oil slick covering approximately 1 square mile, with diesel oil still bubbling to the surface from below. Debris recovered included wooden planking, cork insulation, and several items of Japanese uniform clothing. The evidence seemed conclusive. A Japanese submarine had been destroyed. The destroyer's action reports were forwarded up the chain of command and reviewed by the commander, 7th Fleet. Based on the evidence presented, I-12 was officially credited as sunk, her name added to the list of confirmed kills. The coordinates of the sinking 10 degrees, 42, N, 124 degrees, 55E, were recorded for future reference. Neither McCormack nor anyone else involved in the attack had any reason to doubt their success or suspect that I-12's story was far from over. Yet, on January 29th, 1945, more than 2 months after I-12 was supposedly destroyed in the Philippines, Australian coastal watchers in New Guinea reported witnessing a submarine matching her description being attacked by Allied aircraft near Wewak Harbour. The pilot's gun camera footage, later examined by intelligence analysts, showed a submarine with markings consistent with I-12's identification numbers. The coastal watch station at Cape Moam, manned by Australian Army personnel trained to observe and report Japanese naval activity, logged the sighting at 1,425 hours local time. Through binoculars, the observers saw a submarine running on the surface approximately 2 miles offshore, heading northwest at what appeared to be moderate speed. The submarine's conning tower displayed identification numbers that the observers recorded as I-12, though distance and sea conditions made absolute certainty difficult. The observers immediately radioed the sighting to the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Tadji, where 2 Beaufort bombers were scrambled to intercept. The aircraft, carrying depth bombs and equipped with gun cameras to document their attacks, reached the area within 20 minutes. By that time, the submarine had increased speed and was making for deeper water, apparently aware she had been detected. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison, commanding the lead Beaufort, spotted the submarine at 1,448 hours and began his attack approach. His gun camera, which recorded at 10 frames per second, captured the submarine from multiple angles as he made his bombing run. The footage showed a clear view of the conning tower, with large numbers painted on the hull numbers that appeared to be I-12. When the film was later analysed frame by frame, Morrison released 4 depth bombs in a stick pattern ahead of the submarine's track. At least 2 appeared to detonate within lethal range based on the water columns observed. The submarine's bow lifted momentarily from the impact, then settled back as she continued her dive. Morrison's wingman made a second attack run, but by then the submarine had submerged completely, and his bombs fell on empty water where she had been. Surface vessels were dispatched to the area to search for wreckage, but nightfall interrupted the operation before any definitive evidence could be recovered. The following day, patrol boats found an oil slick at the attack coordinates, though it was smaller and less convincing than the one observed after the November attack in the Philippines. No debris was recovered, and sonar searches detected no wreck on the seafloor. The gun camera footage became the subject of intense analysis. Intelligence officers examined the film repeatedly, trying to confirm the identification numbers on the submarine's conning tower. The consensus was that the numbers did appear to be I-12, though some analysts cautioned that image quality, distance, and viewing angle made definitive identification impossible. The submarine could potentially have been I-10, I-14, or another boat with similar numbers. What made the identification particularly controversial was the date. If I-12 had been sunk on November 13th as claimed by USS Haggard and USS Franks, she couldn't possibly be operating near New Guinea on January 29th. Either the November sinking hadn't occurred despite the evidence, or the submarine at New Guinea wasn't I-12 despite the markings, or something impossible had happened that allowed a sunk submarine to resume operations. In 1987, a former crew member of I-12 came forward with a story he had kept silent for over 40 years. Petty Officer Takeshi Yamamoto claimed he had been transferred off the submarine just before her final patrol, a routine rotation that saved his life but left him haunted by questions. Yamamoto had served aboard I-12 for 18 months before receiving orders in late October 1944 to transfer to shore duty at Yokosuka. The transfer was part of a standard rotation policy designed to give experienced crew members rest periods and allow them to train new recruits. He packed his belongings, said goodbye to shipmates he'd lived alongside in the cramped submarine for over a year, and departed the boat on October 28, 1944. According to his account, I-12 departed Kure on November 1st for what should have been a 2-month patrol in the Philippines. Yamamoto watched from the pier as his former home slipped beneath the waves during diving trials in the harbour, then surfaced and headed out to sea. It was the last time he saw the submarine or any of his former crewmates. When news reached Yokosuka in late November that I-12 had been sunk with all hands, Yamamoto was devastated. He attended the memorial service held for the crew, standing with other submariners to honour the fallen. The Navy provided him with a list of the dead, and he recognised every name these were men he'd eaten with, worked alongside, shared the dangers of war patrols with for months. What troubled Yamamoto decades later was a chance encounter in early February 1945. He was walking through Yokosuka when he saw someone who looked remarkably like Chief Petty Officer Kenji Sato, I-12's chief engineer. The man was in uniform, walking with purpose toward the administrative building. Yamamoto called out to him, but the figure didn't respond and disappeared around a corner before Yamamoto could catch up. Yamamoto dismissed it as a case of mistaken identity. Sato had died in November, along with the rest of I-12's crew. Yet the encounter nagged at him. When he checked the administrative records, he found no indication that any I-12 crew members had survived. But he also discovered something odd. Several personnel files for I-12 crew members showed activity dates in December and January, after the submarine had supposedly been destroyed. He raised his concerns with a superior officer, who told him the dates were administrative errors and instructed him not to discuss the matter. The subject was closed, and Yamamoto said nothing more about it for over 4 decades. But the questions remained, resurfacing when he learned in the 1,980 seconds about the disputed nature of I-12's sinking. In his 1987 statement to a Japanese naval historian, Yamamoto described the confusion he'd felt seeing what appeared to be activity logs dated after the sinking. He provided copies of several documents he'd kept from his service, including a letter from a former I-12 crewmate's family, thanking him for attending the memorial but dated February 1945, 3 months after the supposed sinking. Yamamoto died in 1994, maintaining until the end that something about I-12's fate had never been properly explained. His documentation, preserved in the archives of the Japanese Naval Historical Society, remains among the evidence that suggests the submarine story involves more than a simple case of mistaken identity. When I-165 pulled into Kure Harbor on August 2, 1945, the duty officer who processed her arrival noticed immediately that something was off. The submarine had been at sea for 46 days, but her fuel consumption logs indicated she should have run dry a week earlier. Lieutenant Tanaka was conducting the routine arrival inspection, checking I-165's logs against expected values based on patrol duration and distance travelled. Submarines were meticulously tracked fuel consumption, battery usage, food stores, even water consumption were all calculated and compared against standards to verify that crews were reporting accurately and to identify any mechanical inefficiencies that needed correction. The fuel discrepancy jumped out immediately. I-165 had departed with full tanks containing approximately 110 tons of diesel fuel. Based on her patrol route and the time at sea, she should have consumed roughly 95 tons, leaving about 15 tons remaining. The fuel gauges read 28 tons, nearly double what should have been left. Either the fuel consumption calculations were drastically wrong, or I-165 had somehow been refueled during her patrol. Tanaka questioned Commander Hayashi, I-165's captain, about the discrepancy. Hayashi seemed genuinely confused by the question. According to his logs, they had been at sea for 31 days, not 46. He produced the captain's daily log showing departure on July 2nd and arrival on August 2nd, exactly 31 days. But the harbour master's records showed I-165 had actually departed on June 17th, a full 15 days earlier. The investigation deepened when Tanaka examined the navigation logs. Every day of the patrol was accounted for with position reports, weather observations, and notes about patrol activities. But when he counted the daily entries, there were only 31 pages, each dated sequentially from July 2nd through August 2nd. The 15 days from June 17th through July 1st were simply absent, as if they had never occurred. Hayashi was adamant that his records were correct. He remembered departing on July 2nd. He'd had a final dinner with his family the evening before, celebrating his daughter's birthday on July 1st. His executive officer confirmed the departure date. So did the navigator, the engineering officer, and every crew member questioned. All agreed they had departed in early July and had been at sea for 31 days, yet physical evidence contradicted their memories. The harbour master's log showed I-165 casting off on June 17th, with multiple witnesses, including a photographer who had taken pictures of the departure. Those photographs existed, showing I-165 leaving Kure on a date that her crew claimed they were still in port. The photographs even showed some of I-165's crew members on deck, men who insisted they hadn't departed until July 2nd. Medical examinations added another layer of mystery. Navy doctors examined the crew to assess their physical condition after the patrol. The level of vitamin depletion in their blood work was consistent with 30 days at sea, not 46. Their beard growth matched a 30-day period. Even the calluses on their hands suggested 30 days of work, not 6 weeks. The galley records showed food consumption for 31 days. The engineering logs showed 31 days of engine operation and maintenance. The battery charge-discharge cycles numbered 31, not 46. Every piece of internal documentation supported the crew's claim of a 31-day patrol. Only the external evidence, the departure date recorded by the harbour master, indicated otherwise. Interviews with the crew revealed an even stranger detail. According to their navigation logs and the captain's personal journal, they had been at sea for only 31 days. The 15-day discrepancy couldn't be explained by simple math errors. Every crew member interviewed separately gave the same account. The interviews were conducted methodically, with crew members questioned individually to prevent any possibility of coordinated stories. Lieutenant Tanaka, assisted by 2 other officers, spoke with 43 of I-165's 92 crew members over 3 days. Each interview followed the same format, asking the sailor to recount the patrol chronologically, describe notable events, and specify dates for key moments. The consistency of the responses was striking. Every crew member remembered departing Kure on July 2nd. Many recalled specific details. One sailor mentioned seeing fireworks from a festival the night before departure, an event that records showed had indeed occurred on July 1st. Another remembered hearing a radio broadcast about Allied bombing raids on the morning of departure, a broadcast confirmed to have aired on July 2nd. The patrol itself was described as largely uneventful. I-165 had been assigned to patrol waters off the Bonin Islands, conducting surveillance and looking for targets of opportunity. The crew described routine days of submerged operations during daylight, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat. They encountered no enemy vessels, made no attacks, experienced no mechanical problems requiring emergency procedures. When asked to account for specific dates, crew members could provide coherent narratives for each day, from July 2nd through August 2nd. The executive officer's daily briefings were recorded in multiple crew members' personal journals, with dates that matched the official logs. Weather observations noted in various journals corresponded with meteorological records for the dates claimed. Not for the earlier dates, the harbour master's records indicated. The navigator, Lieutenant Watanabe, was particularly emphatic about the timeline. He had taken star sights every clear evening, calculating the submarine's position and recording the results in his navigation workbook. The workbook contained 31 sets of calculations, dated from July 2nd through August 2nd, each showing the submarine's position at evening twilight. Watanabe insisted he had been fastidious about dating each entry correctly. It was fundamental to navigation to maintain accurate date records. What puzzled investigators was the absence of any memory gap or confusion among the crew. If they had somehow lost 15 days, perhaps through some medical condition, mass unconsciousness, or other extraordinary event, there should have been discontinuity in their memories, moments where time seemed to jump forward inexplicably. Instead, the crew described a continuous, uninterrupted 31 days, with no gaps, no missing time, no moments of confusion. Several crew members mentioned that their personal calendars and watches all showed August 2nd when they arrived at Kure. One sailor had been keeping a calendar, crossing off each day of the patrol. His calendar showed 31 crossed-off days starting from July 2nd. Another sailor had been counting down days until his daughter's birthday on August 5th. By his count, the birthday was 3 days away when they reached port. The chief engineer produced maintenance logs showing 31 days of engine operation with detailed entries for each day, oil consumption, fuel usage, routine maintenance tasks, all documented for 31 consecutive days with no gaps. If the submarine had actually been at sea for 46 days, there should have been an additional 15 days of maintenance activities recorded, but the logs contained no such entries. Medical examinations of the crew showed physiological signs consistent with 30 days at sea, not 46. Their beards had grown to the length expected after a month. Their vitamin deficiency markers matched a 30-day patrol. Even the food consumption records from the galley supported the shorter time frame. Dr. Nakamura, the naval medical officer conducting the examinations, had examined returning submarine crews for 3 years and knew what to expect. Submariners developed characteristic physical changes during extended patrols, vitamin deficiencies from limited fresh food, weight loss from the physical stress and inadequate nutrition, specific patterns of beard growth, even changes in their skin condition from the humid, enclosed environment. For a 46-day patrol, Nakamura would expect to see significant vitamin C depletion, possibly early signs of scurvy, bleeding gums, easy bruising, fatigue. Blood tests on I-165's crew showed vitamin levels consistent with 30 days of preserved rations, not the more severe depletion expected after 6 weeks. The crew showed no signs of scurvy or advanced vitamin deficiency. The weight measurements were equally telling. Submariners typically lost 1 to 2 pounds per week on patrol due to stress, inadequate caloric intake, and the physical demands of shipboard life. If I-165's crew had been at sea for 46 days, they should have lost an average of 7 to 9 pounds per man. Medical records showed an average weight loss of 4.3 pounds, consistent with 30 days, not 46. Beard growth provided another measurable indicator. Human facial hair grows at a relatively constant rate of approximately 0.4 millimeters per day. After 30 days, beards should measure roughly 12 millimeters in length. Nakamura measured beard length on crew members who had shaved immediately before departure and not since. The measurements averaged 11.8 millimeters, matching the 30-day timeline. The galley inventory offered concrete documentation. The submarine's cook had maintained detailed records of food consumption, noting each meal served and the supplies used. His records showed 93 days' worth of provisions loaded before departure, 3 meals per day for 92 crew members, plus margins for waste and unexpected extensions. After the patrol, the remaining supplies were inventoried. The amount consumed matched 31 days of feeding, 92 men, not 46 days. Water consumption records told the same story. Submarines carried limited fresh water for drinking and cooking, with daily allowances strictly rationed. The water tanks showed consumption consistent with 31 days at the standard ration of 1 gallon per man per day. If the crew had been at sea for 46 days, they would have either run out of water or been on severely reduced rations, neither of which appeared to be the case. Even the submarine's mechanical systems provided evidence. The air purification system used chemical scrubbers to remove carbon dioxide from the submarine's atmosphere. These scrubbers had a known lifespan based on usage hours. When examined, I-165's scrubbers showed wear consistent with 30 days of operation, not 46. The battery cells showed 31 charge-discharge cycles based on electrolyte condition, not 46. Dr. Nakamura's final report concluded that the crew's physical condition was consistent in every measurable way with a 30-day patrol. He could find no physiological evidence supporting a 46-day duration. Either every measurement, test and observation was somehow wrong, or I-165's crew had genuinely experienced only 30 days at sea despite external records indicating otherwise. Where had those 15 days gone? Naval investigators treated the incident as a potential security breach, suspecting the submarine had made an unauthorized stop somewhere, perhaps to meet with black market contacts or even to explore the possibility of defecting to Allied forces as the war neared its end. The security investigation was launched immediately after the discrepancies were discovered. In August 1945, with Japan on the verge of surrender, Naval Command was acutely concerned about submarines potentially being used for unauthorized purposes. Smuggling war criminals out of Japan, transporting looted valuables, or even attempting to defect with valuable military secrets. I-165's missing 15 days raised all these red flags. Commander Ishikawa led the investigation team, reviewing every aspect of I-165's patrol. If the submarine had made an unauthorized port call, there would be evidence fuel consumption that didn't match the reported route, damage or wear patterns suggesting harbor maneuvering, crew members observed ashore, or communications intercepts indicating contact with unusual parties. The investigation found none of these indicators. The fuel consumption data actually argued against an unauthorized stop. If I-165 had deviated from her patrol route to visit a secret port, the additional distance traveled would have shown up in fuel usage. Instead, the fuel remaining was higher than expected even for the shorter 31-day patrol, the crew reported. This suggested the submarine had somehow used less fuel than normal operations would require, not more. Investigators interviewed local contacts at potential unauthorized ports where I-165 might have stopped. Intelligence officers visited isolated harbors in Taiwan, the Philippines, and various Pacific islands, asking if anyone had seen a Japanese submarine in mid-June or July. No credible reports emerged. No merchants mentioned selling supplies to a submarine crew. No fishermen reported unusual submarine activity. No coastal observers logged suspicious vessel movements. The black market theory was investigated thoroughly. By 1945, a thriving black market existed throughout the Japanese Empire, with military personnel sometimes diverting supplies or equipment for personal profit. If I-165 had been involved in smuggling operations, crew members might have profited financially. Investigators examined bank records and personal finances of I-165's officers and senior enlisted men, looking for unexplained deposits or purchases. They found nothing unusual. The defection theory seemed more plausible given the timing. In late July and early August 1945, some Japanese military personnel were beginning to realize the war was lost and exploring options for survival. A submarine would be a valuable asset for anyone planning to escape to neutral territory or negotiate with Allied forces. However, I-165 had returned to Kure rather than fleeing to a neutral port, arguing against defection as an explanation. Investigators examined whether I-165 might have encountered and communicated with Allied forces during the missing 15 days. Radio intercepts were reviewed to see if any transmissions had been detected from I-165 outside her normal reporting schedule. Allied intelligence was consulted to determine if any American or Australian forces had made contact with a Japanese submarine in the relevant time frame. The psychological evaluation of Commander Hayashi found him competent, truthful, and showing no signs of attempting to deceive. He genuinely believed his account of the patrol was accurate. The consistency of his story under repeated questioning and the corroboration from his entire crew suggested either they were all telling the truth or they had been subject to some shared delusion that affected their perception and memory of time. In the final months of the war, Allied sonar operators and radar stations began reporting contacts with a submarine bearing I-373's acoustic signature in locations that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She would appear off the coast of Taiwan, then 6 hours later be detected near Okinawa, then surface near Iwo Jima before Allied ships could converge on any of these positions. The first report came on April 12, 1945, when an American destroyer escort detected a submarine contact off the eastern coast of Taiwan at coordinates 23 degrees 15 N, 121 degree 30 E. The sonar signature, the specific acoustic pattern created by the submarine's propellers, machinery, and hull characteristics was recorded and analysed. Each submarine produced a unique acoustic signature, like a fingerprint, allowing experienced operators to identify specific vessels. 6 hours and 20 minutes later, at 1,445 hours that same day, a different Allied vessel detected what appeared to be the same submarine near Okinawa at 26 degrees 20 N, 127 degrees 45 E. The distance between these two positions was approximately 440 nautical miles. Even at maximum surface speed, I-373 could have covered only 140 miles in that time. The detection seemed impossible unless two submarines with identical acoustic signatures were operating simultaneously, or the identification was wrong, or something unexplained was occurring. The pattern continued over subsequent days. I-373's signature would appear in one location, then reappear hours later hundreds of miles away. On April 15th, she was detected south of Kyushu at dawn, then near Iwo Jima that afternoon, a journey of over 800 miles supposedly completed in 8 hours. On April 19th, contacts were reported simultaneously off Taiwan and near Okinawa, suggesting I-373 was somehow present in two locations at once. Allied anti-submarine forces were baffled. Standard procedure when detecting a submarine was to vector multiple ships to the contact location for a coordinated attack, but every time ships converged on I-373's reported position, the submarine vanished before they arrived. By the time surface vessels reached the contact coordinates, sonar sweeps found nothing. It was as if I-373 could predict when hunters were approaching and disappear before they arrived. Some operations officers theorized that multiple submarines were operating with modified propellers and machinery designed to produce similar acoustic signatures, specifically to create confusion. This would be a sophisticated deception tactic, requiring precise engineering and coordination. However, Japanese naval records examined after the war showed no evidence of such a program. I-373 appeared to be operating alone, not as part of a coordinated deception effort. Another theory suggested that unusual ocean conditions were creating acoustic propagation anomalies, carrying I-373's sound signature over vast distances and creating false contacts far from the submarine's actual location. Sound waves in water can travel hundreds of miles under the right conditions, especially in deep water with specific temperature and salinity layers. But the reported contacts weren't faint or distorted, they were strong, clear signals indicating a submarine nearby, not hundreds of miles away. The acoustic analysis centers in Hawaii and Australia both reviewed the recordings of I-373's signature. They confirmed that the sound pattern was consistent across all reported contacts. Same propeller rotation rate, same machinery noise, characteristics, same hull resonances. Either it was the same submarine appearing in multiple locations with impossible speed, or someone had created perfect acoustic duplicates, or the detection equipment was experiencing systematic failures at multiple stations. What made the situation even more perplexing was that some of the reported contacts included visual sightings. On April 23rd, an American patrol aircraft reported seeing I-373 on the surface near the Ryukyu Islands. The pilot identified the submarine by her distinctive conning tower configuration and recorded the encounter on gun camera film. 3 hours later, a different aircraft reported engaging I-373 near Taiwan over 400 miles from the first sighting. Both pilots were experienced in submarine identification and were confident in their assessments. What made these sightings particularly credible was their consistency with I-373's known tactical profile. Each detection occurred in shipping lanes where she had previously operated, and the attack patterns matched her commander's documented preferences for night surface approaches and quick disengagement. Captain Yoshimura, I-373's commander, had developed a reputation for aggressive tactics during his previous patrols. His approach was to position the submarine near known shipping routes, wait submerged during daylight, then surface at dusk to intercept vessels silhouetted against the twilight sky. He preferred quick torpedo attacks followed by immediate withdrawal, avoiding prolonged engagement with escorts. This pattern had served him well through 7 previous patrols. Intelligence analysts studying the April-July 1,945 contacts noted that each apparent I-373 sighting occurred in areas consistent with Yoshimura's historical operating patterns. The Taiwan contacts were in shipping lanes he'd used successfully in 1944. The Okinawa positions matched approaches he'd employed during earlier patrols. Even the timing of the contacts, predominantly at dawn or dusk, matched his preferred attack windows. Several merchant vessels reported submarine attacks during this period that fit I-373's methods. A freighter was torpedoed off Taiwan on April 17th in a quick surface attack at twilight, the submarine firing 2 torpedoes from 800 yards, then disappearing before escorts could respond. The attack profile was classic Yoshimura close approach, quick strike, immediate withdrawal. Yet the same day, a submarine matching I-373's description was reported attacking a convoy near Okinawa, using identical tactics. The escorts assigned to hunt I-373 found themselves chasing a ghost. When they deployed to Taiwan waters based on reports of submarine activity, new contacts would appear near Okinawa. When they shifted to Okinawa, I-373 would surface near Iwo Jima. The submarine seemed to anticipate their movements, always staying one step ahead, always operating in areas where hunting forces weren't currently positioned. Some naval officers suggested that I-373's commander had developed an uncanny ability to predict Allied patrol patterns and exploit gaps in their coverage. Yoshimura was known to be intelligent and methodical. Perhaps he had studied Allied tactics sufficiently to identify weaknesses in their anti-submarine deployment. By moving rapidly between areas and timing his attacks for moments when hunting groups were elsewhere, he could create the illusion of impossible mobility. However, this theory required I-373 to maintain speeds and transit distances that exceeded her documented capabilities. Even the most aggressive submarine commander couldn't overcome physical limitations. Maximum speed, fuel capacity, crew endurance. The distances involved in some of the reported movements simply couldn't be covered in the available time, no matter how clever the tactics. The pattern of sightings also showed unusual predictability that didn't fit with Yoshimura's known caution. An experienced submarine commander would vary his tactics, avoid falling into patterns that enemies could exploit. Yet, I-373's reported activities were almost formulaic: appear in location A, attack at twilight, disappear, reappear in location B 6 to 8 hours later. This predictability should have made her easier to catch, yet every attempt to intercept her failed. Post-war analysis of I-373's fuel capacity and range added to the mystery. Her maximum range at cruising speed was approximately 14,000 nautical miles without refueling. The cumulative distance of all the reported positions between April and August would have exceeded 20,000 miles. Even accounting for some reports being false or misidentified, I-373 appeared to be operating well beyond her theoretical range without any reported refueling operations. The most rational explanation was that Allied forces were tracking multiple submarines and misidentifying them all as I-373. Acoustic signatures could be similar, visual identifications could be wrong in the heat of combat, and the fog of war could easily create confusion. This theory was thoroughly investigated by Allied intelligence after several embarrassing incidents where multiple ships claimed to have sunk the same submarine. The possibility that I-373 contacts were actually several different submarines would explain the apparent ability to be in multiple places nearly simultaneously. Different boats with similar propeller characteristics might produce acoustic signatures that tired sonar operators could confuse, especially under stressful combat conditions. The Japanese Type B submarines, of which I-373 was one, shared many common design features. They had similar propeller designs, similar diesel engines, and similar hull configurations. Under certain conditions, their acoustic signatures could be difficult to distinguish, particularly if the detecting equipment was at long range, or if water conditions degraded signal quality. A sonar operator who had previously identified I-373 might assume that any similar signature was the same submarine. Visual identification was equally problematic. Submarine identification from aircraft or surface ships required observers to note specific features: conning tower shape, deck gun configuration, overall length, and distinctive markings. In brief glimpses during combat, especially in poor visibility or at long range, these details could be difficult to verify. A pilot might see a Japanese submarine and, knowing I-373 operated in the area, assume that's what he was observing. The intelligence community attempted to cross-reference all I-373 sightings with known positions of other Japanese submarines. This analysis was complicated by incomplete information about Japanese submarine deployments, gaps in Allied tracking, and the possibility that some Japanese submarines were operating without Allied forces being aware of their existence. The cross-referencing suggested that some contacts attributed to I-373 might have actually been I-361, I-367, or other submarines with similar designations. However, several aspects of the reports resisted the multiple submarine explanation. The acoustic signatures weren't just similar in several cases, they were identical when analysed in detail. Recording equipment had advanced considerably by 1945, allowing technicians to identify specific characteristics of individual submarines, particular blade damage on propellers, unique vibration patterns from machinery, resonances specific to individual hulls. The I-373 signatures showed these identifying details consistently across multiple contacts. Additionally, the reported attack patterns weren't just similar to I-373's tactics. They included specific details that seemed characteristic of Captain Yoshimura's personal style. One pilot reported that the submarine he attacked executed a distinctive diving maneuver, rolling slightly to port before descending, a technique Yoshimura had been observed using on previous patrols. It seemed unlikely that multiple submarine commanders would independently adopt this identical maneuver. The gun camera footage from several aircraft encounters was analysed frame by frame by Japanese submarine identification experts. In at least 3 separate incidents, the film showed what appeared to be identical damage to the submarine's conning tower, a dent or scrape on the starboard side, approximately 3 feet below the periscope housing. This damage had been noted in previous visual confirmations of I-373 and appeared to be a unique identifying feature. The presence of this damage in footage from incidents hundreds of miles apart was difficult to explain if these were different submarines. On August 10th, 1945, all reported sightings of I-373 ceased abruptly. The submarine that had seemed to be everywhere suddenly vanished completely. Her acoustic signature never detected again. No wreckage ever found. No survivors ever recovered. The final confirmed contact with I-373 occurred at 0634 hours on August 10th, when a radar-equipped patrol aircraft detected a surface submarine approximately 90 miles southwest of Okinawa. The aircraft was vectoring surface vessels to the contact when the submarine dove. By the time destroyers arrived at the position, sonar searches found no trace of her. It was a scenario that had played out dozens of times before during I-373's apparent appearances throughout the previous months. What made this contact significant was its finality. In the days and weeks following August 10th, no further I-373 sightings were reported. The acoustic signature that had appeared so frequently across vast stretches of the Pacific simply stopped. The shipping lane attacks ceased. The impossible transits from one location to another ended. It was as if I-373 had reached some predetermined endpoint and vanished. The timing was notable because it coincided with critical moments in the war's end. August 10th was the day after the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, and Japanese leadership was in the final stages of debating surrender terms. Some submarines had begun receiving coded messages, instructing them to cease offensive operations and prepare for potential surrender. Did I-373 receive such orders? Did she respond by simply disappearing? Allied naval intelligence continued monitoring for I-373's signature through August and into September, even after Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd. The comprehensive sweep of Japanese naval radio frequencies, the extensive sonar monitoring of known submarine operating areas, and the systematic searches of harbours and anchorages turned up no sign of her. Other Japanese submarines were located and either surrendered or were found scuttled. I-373 remained absent. When Allied forces occupied Japan and began cataloguing surviving naval assets, I-373 didn't appear on any port roster. She wasn't found damaged in dry dock, wasn't discovered scuttled in shallow water, wasn't located abandoned at any naval facility. Japanese naval records were examined to determine her last known status. But the records were incomplete and contradictory. Some suggested she had been lost in April. Others indicated she was still operational in July. Interviews with Japanese submarine command personnel produced no definitive answers. Officers who should have known I-373's status provided vague or contradictory information. Some stated she had been sunk earlier in the year, though they couldn't specify when or where. Others believed she was still on patrol when the war ended, and assumed she had been scuttled by her crew rather than surrendered. No one could provide concrete information about her final disposition. The possibility that I-373 had been sunk and her loss not properly reported was considered. In the chaos of the war's final months, administrative procedures had broken down. Submarines could be lost without headquarters being notified. Records could be destroyed or lost, and the death of communications personnel could mean that vital information never reached those who needed it. Perhaps I-373 had been destroyed in some unreported engagement, her fate unknown even to Japanese command. Another theory suggested I-373 had been deliberately scuttled in deep water by a crew unwilling to surrender. Japanese military culture emphasized honor and resistance to capture. Some submarines received orders to destroy themselves, rather than allow their vessels and crews to be taken prisoner. I-373 might have submerged to maximum depth and flooded, taking her crew and secrets to the ocean floor in a final act of defiance. Among the technical logs recovered after the war was a curious entry from I-58, sister submarine to several of the missing vessels. Her chief engineer had recorded an incident during a depth charge attack, where the submarine had gone deeper than her design specifications should have allowed, considerably deeper. The entry in I-58's engineering log was dated March 24, 1945, and described an attack by American destroyers that forced the submarine into an emergency deep dive. Chief Engineer Tanaka wrote that depth gauge readings reached 615 feet before the submarine stabilized and began ascending. This depth exceeded I-58's rated maximum depth of 330 feet by nearly 300 feet, and was well beyond the theoretical crush depth where the pressure hull should have catastrophically failed. The entry noted several anomalies during the deep dive. Water pressure at 615 feet should have been approximately 265 pounds per square inch, yet the hull appeared to be withstanding pressures far beyond its design limits. Tanaka recorded, "No leaks, no structural sounds, hull integrity maintained, despite the submarine being at a depth where the pressure should have been collapsing compartments and splitting seams." Most puzzling was Tanaka's observation that the pressure gauge readings seemed inconsistent with the submarine's actual depth. He noted that external pressure indicators showed depth beyond rating, but hull response suggests normal operating depth. This cryptic comment suggested the gauges were reading depths the submarine shouldn't be reaching, while the structural behavior indicated the submarine was actually at a safer depth. Either the gauges were malfunctioning, or something unusual was affecting how depth and pressure related to each other. The log entry also mentioned that compass behavior became erratic at extreme depth. The magnetic compass began spinning without settling on any heading, while the gyro compass tumbled and needed to be reset after the submarine returned to shallower water. Tanaka attributed this to the stress of the deep dive, but the technical details he recorded suggested something more unusual might have been occurring. Temperature readings during the deep dive showed unexpected variations. Tanaka noted that water temperature at depth was reading significantly colder than expected for that depth in that location. The temperature dropped from 78 degrees Fahrenheit at 150 feet to 42 degrees Fahrenheit at the maximum depth, a gradient far steeper than normal oceanographic patterns would predict. Such rapid temperature drops might indicate the submarine had somehow transited through unusual water masses, or that the temperature sensing equipment was affected by whatever allowed the submarine to survive the extreme depth. When I-58 returned to port and underwent inspection, the hull showed no signs of having been subjected to the crushing pressures that 615 feet of depth should have created. Normally, a submarine that exceeded crush depth would show permanent deformation, compressed hull plates, stressed welds, buckled frames. I-58's hull appeared normal, with no indication of overstress. Inspectors noted this in their reports but had no explanation for how the submarine had survived intact. Tanaka's account was corroborated by other crew members interviewed about the incident. The executive officer recalled the depth gauge readings and the confusion in the control room when the submarine descended far below safe limits without suffering the expected structural failure. The diving officer remembered the difficulty in regaining depth control and the strange behavior of the instruments during the ascent. Similar reports emerged from other submarines in the final months of the war. I-53 recorded reaching 580 feet during an emergency dive in May 1945. I-36 logged an incident where depth gauges indicated 640 feet, but the hull showed no distress. In each case, the submarines descended well beyond their rated capabilities and survived without explanation, leaving engineering officers puzzled about what had occurred and why their vessels hadn't been crushed. Extended segments 36 to 40, 400 words each. Paradox. Standard Type B submarines like I-58 were rated for a maximum depth of 330 feet before the pressure hull risked catastrophic failure. Safety margins allowed them to push to perhaps 400 feet in emergency situations, though doing so risked permanent damage to the hull integrity. The engineering specifications for Type B submarines were based on extensive testing and calculation. The pressure hull, the innermost watertight cylinder that protected the crew and equipment, was constructed from steel plates 18 to 22 millimeters thick, reinforced by internal frames spaced at regular intervals. These frames were designed to distribute the external water pressure evenly across the hull surface, preventing localized stress concentrations that could cause buckling. At 330 feet depth, the external water pressure reached approximately 143 pounds per square inch. The hull design incorporated safety factors, meaning it was actually capable of withstanding somewhat higher pressures before failure, but submarine doctrine established 330 feet as the maximum safe operating depth. Beyond this limit, the risk of catastrophic implosion increased exponentially with each additional foot of descent. The physics of pressure hull failure were well understood. As a submarine descended beyond its rated depth, the hull plates would begin to deform, bowing inward between the supporting frames. This deformation would stress the welds and rivets holding the plates together. At some point, typically around 500 to 550 feet for Type B submarines, a critical stress threshold would be exceeded, When this happened, failure would be instantaneous and total. The hull would implode in milliseconds, the pressure wave killing everyone aboard before their brains could register what was happening. Yet multiple submarine commanders reported surviving descents far beyond this critical threshold. I-58's descent to 615 feet should have resulted in hull collapse at around 520 feet. The fact that the submarine descended an additional 95 feet and then successfully returned to the surface defied the engineering calculations. The hull should have imploded, but it didn't. One hypothesis proposed by post-war researchers was that unusual water density conditions might have affected the pressure-depth relationship. Water density increases with depth, salinity, and decreasing temperature. In regions where cold, saline water form distinct layers, the pressure at a given depth might be slightly different than standard oceanographic models predicted. However, the variations would be minor, perhaps 5 to 10% different from expected values, nowhere near enough to explain submarines surviving at double their rated depth. Another theory suggested that the depth gauges themselves were malfunctioning, giving false readings that made submarines appear deeper than they actually were. Depth gauges worked by measuring water pressure through a sealed bellows mechanism that expanded or contracted based on external pressure. If these mechanisms were damaged or miscalibrated, they could provide inaccurate readings. However, the temperature readings and other environmental data recorded during these deep dives corroborated the extreme depths, suggesting the gauges were functioning correctly. The most troubling aspect was the complete lack of hull damage. When I-58 was inspected after her 615-foot dive, engineers found no evidence of overstress. The hull plates showed no deformation, the welds showed no cracking, the frames showed no bending. It was as if the submarine had never exceeded normal operating depth, despite multiple crew members witnessing the depth gauge readings and experiencing the associated environmental changes. Some researchers noted that all the extreme depth incidents occurred in specific geographic regions, particularly in waters near the Mariana Trench and around the Philippine archipelago, areas where the ocean floor dropped away to enormous depths and where unusual oceanographic conditions prevailed. Whether these locations somehow modified the normal laws of physics, or whether they simply provided the circumstances where submarines were forced into desperate deep dives, remained an open question. One pattern that emerged from studying multiple disappearances was the unusual frequency of reported navigation equipment failures on Japanese submarines in the final year of the war. Compasses spinning without cause, gyroscopes tumbling, radio direction finders pointing in impossible directions. The compass failures were particularly troubling because they affected both magnetic and gyroscopic systems simultaneously. Something that shouldn't occur since these systems operated on completely different physical principles. Magnetic compasses align with Earth's magnetic field, while gyrocompasses use the rotation of the Earth to maintain a stable north reference. A failure affecting both systems suggested either catastrophic equipment damage or an environmental condition that disrupted both mechanisms. I-177's final message, transmitted on October 3, 1944, reported that all navigation equipment had failed simultaneously while operating near the Sunda Strait. The magnetic compass was spinning continuously, the gyro compass had tumbled and wouldn't re-establish north, and even the simple magnetic compass used for emergency backup was behaving erratically. The navigator reported being unable to determine the submarine's heading or establish a reliable course. Similar reports came from other submarines. I-44 transmitted on April 15th, 1945, that navigation equipment was unreliable and that celestial navigation was impossible due to persistent cloud cover. The submarine's position report placed her approximately 200 miles from where subsequent analysis suggested she should have been based on her previous track. I-44 was never heard from again after that transmission. The gyro compass failures were particularly puzzling because these instruments were designed to be extraordinarily stable. A gyro compass used a rapidly spinning wheel mounted in gimbals, with the wheel's axis naturally aligning to true north due to the Earth's rotation. Causing a properly functioning gyro compass to tumble required severe physical shock, the kind of impact from a depth charge explosion or collision. Yet submarines were reporting gyro compass failures under normal operating conditions with no indication of external shock. Radio direction finding equipment also exhibited strange behavior. RDF systems allowed submarines to determine their position by taking bearings on known radio transmitters ashore. Multiple submarines reported that RDF bearings were giving impossible results, indicating that known transmitters were in directions that didn't correspond to the submarine's calculated position. This suggested either the submarine was massively off position, the shore stations had somehow moved, or the radio waves were being propagated through some unusual atmospheric condition that bent their paths. The pattern of these failures showed curious geographic clustering. Most reports came from submarines operating in specific regions: the waters around the Marianas, the Philippine archipelago, the approaches to Japan, through the Nansei-Shoto Island chain, and portions of the East China Sea. Submarines operating in other areas reported far fewer navigation equipment anomalies, suggesting the problems were related to environmental conditions in these specific locations. Japanese naval engineers investigated the compass failures, examining returned submarines for equipment defects. In most cases, the navigation equipment appeared to be functioning normally when tested in port. Gyro compasses that had reportedly tumbled at sea would establish north properly when spun up at the dock. Magnetic compasses that had spun wildly during patrols would settle normally when checked in harbour. The intermittent nature of the failures made them extremely difficult to diagnose and correct. One hypothesis suggested that submarine hulls were somehow becoming magnetized during operations, creating local magnetic fields that interfered with compass function. Steel hulls could acquire magnetic properties through prolonged exposure to Earth's magnetic field, especially if the submarine maintained specific headings for extended periods. However, hull magnetization should have been detectable during port inspections and correctable through degaussing procedures. The fact that navigation equipment tested normally in port argued against hull magnetization as the primary cause. Anomaly theory. Some researchers have pointed to known magnetic anomalies in the Pacific, areas where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual variations that can affect sensitive navigation equipment. These anomalies are well documented and appear on modern naval charts as warnings to submarine commanders. Magnetic anomalies occur when concentrations of magnetized rock in the Earth's crust create localized variations in the planet's magnetic field. These variations can range from minor deviations of a few degrees to major distortions that render magnetic compasses nearly useless. The Pacific Ocean basin contains numerous such anomalies, particularly near areas of volcanic activity and along tectonic plate boundaries where magnetized material is being brought up from the mantle. The most significant known anomaly in the Western Pacific is associated with the Mariana Trench, where the Pacific Plate subducts beneath the Philippine Plate. This region shows magnetic field variations of up to 15 degrees from the expected values, enough to cause significant navigation errors if not properly accounted for. Submarines transiting this area were supposed to rely primarily on gyro compasses rather than magnetic compasses, but if both systems failed, navigators would have no reliable heading reference. Modern oceanographic surveys have identified smaller anomalies throughout the Pacific that weren't well documented in 1945. Some of these create magnetic field variations that change over relatively short distances a submarine could pass from normal magnetic conditions into a strong anomaly within a few miles of travel. For a navigator taking a compass reading every few hours, this could create confusion about the submarine's actual heading and lead to significant position errors. The relationship between magnetic anomalies and submarine disappearances was investigated by Dr. Yamamoto Hiroshi, a Japanese geophysicist, in the 1970 seconds. He plotted the known locations of magnetic anomalies in the Western Pacific against the last reported positions of missing submarines. The correlation was striking. Over 60% of the submarines that disappeared had last reported from positions within 20 miles of known magnetic anomalies. This was far higher than would be expected by chance alone. However, correlation doesn't prove causation. The fact that submarines were near magnetic anomalies when they disappeared didn't necessarily mean the anomalies caused the disappearances. Many submarines operated in these areas without incident. The magnetic variations, while troublesome for navigation, shouldn't directly cause a submarine to sink. At most, they might lead a submarine off course, potentially into dangerous waters or minefields, but they wouldn't directly destroy the vessel. Dr. Yamamoto proposed a more subtle mechanism. He suggested that strong magnetic anomalies might affect submarine electronics and machinery in ways beyond simple compass deviation. If the varying magnetic fields induced electrical currents in the submarine's hull and machinery, they could potentially interfere with depth gauges, sonar equipment, and other critical systems. A submarine operating blind, due to failed instruments, would be vulnerable to accidents colliding with underwater obstacles, losing depth control, or surfacing into the path of enemy forces. More controversial was Yamamoto's speculation about unknown effects of magnetic anomalies. He noted that some of the reported phenomena, simultaneous failure of multiple independent systems, unusual water temperature readings, the sensation of time distortion, suggested effects beyond simple magnetic interference. He carefully avoided making specific claims, but his research raised questions about whether intense magnetic fields might affect other physical processes in ways not yet understood by science. Critics pointed out that many of the magnetic anomalies Yamamoto identified had been mapped well before 1945 and were noted on Japanese naval charts. Submarine navigators were trained to account for local magnetic variations when operating in known anomaly zones. The sophisticated navigation officers aboard Japanese submarines should have been able to compensate for magnetic irregularities and maintain accurate position tracking through alternative methods like celestial navigation. In 2018, a deep-sea research vessel conducting a survey of the Pacific floor for the purpose of mapping undersea volcanic activity picked up an unusual sonar return from a depth of 21,000 feet. The contact showed the clear outline of a submarine, but at a depth that should have crushed any World War II-era vessel into compacted metal. The research vessel, Kaimei, was operating under contract to the Japanese Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, conducting high-resolution bathymetric mapping of the Pacific seafloor. The survey area included portions of the Japan Trench where the Pacific Plate descends beneath the North American Plate, creating ocean depths exceeding 27,000 feet. The multi-beam sonar system could create detailed three-dimensional images of the seafloor at these extreme depths. On July 23, 2018, the sonar operators detected an anomalous contact at coordinates 38 degrees 42 and 143 degrees 55, approximately 220 miles east of Sendai, Japan. The contact appeared at a depth of 21,240 feet, nearly 4 miles below the surface. The sonar image showed an object approximately 360 feet long and 30 feet in diameter, with protrusions consistent with a submarine's conning tower and deck structures. What made the contact extraordinary was its depth. World War II submarines were designed to operate at depths measured in hundreds of feet, not thousands. The crush depth, the depth at which water pressure would cause catastrophic implosion for most Japanese submarines, was around 500 to 600 feet. At 21,000 feet, water pressure exceeded 9,000 pounds per square inch, enough to compress steel into a fraction of its original volume. Any submarine descending to such depth should have imploded and been crushed into an unrecognizable mass of compacted metal. Yet the sonar image showed structural details that suggested the hull retained its basic shape. The outline was clearly submarine-like, with the characteristic cigar shape, the raised conning tower section, and the tapered bow and stern. If this was truly a submarine at 21,000 feet, it had somehow descended to 4 times the depth of the Titanic, while maintaining structural integrity that should have been impossible. The research team deployed a remotely operated vehicle capable of operating at extreme depth to investigate further. The ROV descended for over 5 hours, traveling through the water column to reach the contact. When it arrived at the coordinates, the cameras illuminated an object that was indeed submarine-shaped, lying on its side on a sloping section of the seafloor. Heavy sediment accumulation obscured many details, but the distinctive features of a submarine were visible. The conning tower, the deck gun mounting, the periscope housings. The ROV attempted to approach close enough to identify any hull markings or numbers, but the sediment was too thick and the marine growth too extensive. Decades of accumulation had buried much of the hull, with only the upper portions visible above the seafloor. The team collected sediment samples from around the wreck, hoping that metallic debris or paint fragments might help identify the vessel. What puzzled the researchers most was the hull's condition. While heavily corroded and encrusted with marine growth, the pressure hull appeared to be largely intact. There were no signs of the catastrophic implosion that should have occurred. No severely compressed sections, no shattered hull plates, no debris field of fragmented metal. The submarine seemed to have settled onto the seafloor relatively intact, as if it had descended gradually to this impossible depth. Analysis of the sonar data suggested the submarine had been at this location for at least 50 years, possibly longer. The sediment accumulation patterns and the extent of marine growth were consistent with a wreck that had been on the seafloor since the 1,940 seconds or 1,950 seconds. If this was a Japanese submarine from World War II, it had been lying in the abyss for over 70 years. Japanese naval historians were consulted to determine which submarines had disappeared in this general area. The records showed that I-36 had been lost somewhere east of Japan in 1945, with her last position reported approximately 150 miles from the wreck site. I-65 had also vanished in this region. Without clear identification, it was impossible to determine which submarine the wreck represented, or if it might be an entirely different vessel not listed in the casualty records. The discovery raised profound questions. How did a submarine designed for shallow depths end up at 21,000 feet? Did it descend under power, somehow maintaining integrity far beyond its design limits? Did it sink after being destroyed at the surface, plummeting to the bottom while somehow remaining partially intact? Or was something more unusual at work, some phenomenon that allowed the submarine to reach these depths without the crushing that should have been inevitable? 75 years after these submarines made their final dives, the questions persist in the minds of naval historians, in the memories of families who never learned what happened to their fathers and grandfathers, and in the classified files that still bear Weijie unsolved stamps in the archives of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force. The passage of time has not diminished the mystery surrounding these disappearances. In some ways, it has deepened them. As more records have been declassified and more wrecks have been discovered, each answer has generated new questions. The submarines that have been found often raise more puzzles than they solve, their condition inconsistent with the accepted explanations for their loss. For the families of the missing crew members, the lack of closure remains painful. Unlike losses where wreckage was found and bodies recovered, these disappearances left no graves to visit, no remains to honor, no certainty about when or how death occurred. Some families received personal effects that had been left ashore before the submarine's final patrol, but these objects only emphasized the absence of the men who had owned them. The Japanese government continues to list these submarines as lost, circumstances unknown in official records. Periodic reviews of the cases have been conducted. As new evidence emerges, wreck discoveries, declassified intelligence documents, eyewitness accounts that surface after decades of silence. Each review examines the evidence, evaluates new theories, and ultimately concludes that insufficient information exists to determine what happened with certainty. Modern technology has made it possible to search for these submarines with capabilities that couldn't have been imagined in 1945. Satellite imaging, deep-sea sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and autonomous underwater drones have been deployed to search the areas where submarines vanished. Some wrecks have been found, but others remain completely absent, as if they left our world entirely, rather than simply sinking to the ocean floor. The advent of sophisticated acoustic analysis and ocean modeling has allowed researchers to re-examine reports of unusual sounds and environmental conditions. Computer simulations can now model ocean currents, magnetic fields, and acoustic propagation in ways that might explain some of the anomalies reported by submarine crews. Yet these analyses often raise as many questions as they answer, revealing gaps in our understanding of ocean physics and the limits of wartime-era observation. Theories continue to proliferate. Some researchers pursue conventional explanations, navigation errors, undocumented enemy actions, mechanical failures that left no trace. Others explore more speculative possibilities, magnetic anomalies that affected time perception, underwater phenomena not yet understood by science, even the possibility of temporal displacement. The lack of conclusive evidence means that no theory can be definitively proven or disproven. What unites all these cases is the element of complete disappearance. These weren't submarines that sank and were found decades later. These were vessels that vanished so thoroughly that even the most advanced search technology has failed to locate them. In an age where satellites can image objects the size of a car from orbit, where sonar can map the ocean floor in exquisite detail, the fact that entire submarines remain missing seems almost impossible. The ocean still holds its secrets tightly. For every wreck discovered, dozens remain hidden in depths we can barely reach, in trenches we've barely explored, or in locations we haven't thought to search. The Pacific is vast, covering over 60 million square miles, and most of its depths remain as unknown today as they were in 1945. A submarine could lie on the seafloor for centuries without being found, preserved in the cold darkness, waiting for technology or chance to reveal its resting place. Perhaps that's the final answer these mysteries offer, not a solution, but a reminder. A reminder that despite our technology, our knowledge, our ability to map and measure and analyze, there are still places in the world that resist our understanding. Still questions that have no answers, still silences that refuse to be broken. And in those silences, the crews of these lost submarines remain, suspended between history and mystery, between the known and the unknowable, in waters that may never give up their secrets. Outro. The ocean has always been humanity's greatest mystery, vast and deep and indifferent to our need for answers. For every question we've solved about the seas, a dozen new mysteries have emerged from the depths. The Japanese submarines that vanished during World War II are just a small chapter in that larger story, vessels that slipped beneath the surface and never returned, leaving behind only fragments of radio transmissions, puzzling position reports, and families who would spend lifetimes wondering what happened in those final moments. Tonight, we've explored cases that challenge our understanding of what's possible. Submarines that appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, crews that experienced time differently than the world around them, vessels found at depths that should have crushed them instantly, position reports that defied the laws of physics, equipment failures that suggested forces beyond simple mechanical breakdown. Some of these mysteries may yet be solved. New technology continues to push the boundaries of deep-sea exploration. Archives continue to release classified documents. Wreck hunters continue their searches across the Pacific floor. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, though often those pieces fit together in ways that only deepen the mystery rather than resolving it. For now, these submarines rest in their unknown graves, whether on the ocean floor, buried in sediment, or perhaps somewhere we haven't yet considered. Their crews remain on eternal patrol, frozen in a moment that was supposed to be temporary, but became permanent. The questions about what happened to them persist, passed down through generations, studied by historians, contemplated by anyone who looks at the ocean and wonders what lies beneath. As you drift towards sleep, consider that beneath the waves, in darkness and silence that have lasted decades, these mysteries endure. The submarines wait. The questions remain. And the ocean keeps its secrets, as it always has, as it always will. Until perhaps, one day, the depths finally speak and the lost submarines reveal where they've been all along. Sleep well,